So let's talk through the forces of the Adeptus Astartes with some of the strengths and weaknesses for every single unit in Codex Space Marines. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking power armor, hover tanks and big guns, with a quick look over every single datasheet in the massive tome that is Codex Space Marines, and talking through some of their pros, cons and a general overall rough power rating for each. For this one, let's talk about infantry first, then mounted units, then go on to vehicles, characters and epic heroes at the end. I'll jump straight into it, though if you were looking to pick up any Space Marine models in the near future or other hobby supplies, feel free to check out the discount links down in the video description. They're one of the main things that help support Auspex Tactics and keep all the videos coming, so a big thank you to anyone picking stuff up through them when they do order stuff in. Let's get straight into the Space Marine infantry though, and start out with the battle line choices. First up we have the regular Intercessor squad, 80 points per 5 of them or 160 per 10. Feeling like fairly standard costs for 2 wound Space Marines. After that you get an OC2 unit that's got a fairly good damage output for a sort of basic troops unit, getting to double their firepower of their bolt rifles if they all focus on one target, which they'll usually want to anyway. Plus the sergeant can chip into some melee damage with a power fist as well. They can do some fairly serious anti-horde, though beyond that perhaps the single biggest draw to their datasheet is their sticky objectives rule, and that's just a huge draw to have at least one squad in the army, as it means that you can start them on a home board objective and then have that marked from then on, so later in the game you've got more options going off to counterattack the enemy units that get close, or potentially just completely abandoning the home objective late game if you know that your opponent can't get to it, so you can throw more things into the mid board for damage output and scoring points. Otherwise, for advantages, their firepower is further augmented by the assault and heavy keywords, so it means they can move unusually fast or hit a little bit harder if they're able to stand still for a turn. And they do have some good options for supporting them, good character options to lead them, and usually the vast majority of detachments out there having at least something for them, perhaps being a particularly strong unit for the Anvil Siege Force if you want to try and make that one work. For downsides, they do have diminishing returns on the sticky objective style rule. Lots of lists tend to just use the 1 unit of 5 of them. There's a massive amount of competition for 5 model Space Marine units, all of which can do different good things that can help out the overall army. Their defense is merely okay, and while their damage output I'd say is really quite good, it's also only really all that good against 1 wound infantry. Against anything sturdier than that, they're going to be a little bit more mediocre. Still though a very strong unit, I've given them a 9 out of 10 here. Next up, for their melee counterparts, we've got the Assault Intercessors. They're also battle line infantry units, and they're 75 points for 5 of them, or 150 for 10. They've got the same stat line as the regular Intercessors, high objective control, so quite good at turning over points, nice and cheap, and a fairly expendable relative to other Space Marine units. And then they've got some fairly good skirmish damage dealing with the ability to reroll wound rolls against units on objectives. They've got good character attachment options, and the reroll wound rolls can confer to attached characters, so you could put a fighty character with them, maybe a captain, Azrael, or a Blood Angels captain, and then when they charge onto objectives into the mid-board, that character will hit just extra hard and can be taking out really tough stuff. They'll obviously get on with any detachments that can improve melee. They also like Gladius between advance and charge and the lance stratagem. And if you want to deliver a higher value character combo, then you could take an impulsor alongside them, and that could prevent the unit from getting shot up and also add to their strike range by jumping out the front of it. For downsides, they're kind of slow to get to melee without delivery, and if you don't have a big character along, then they're probably going to be sort of limited in what they can deal with, only really good against sort of medium to lighter infantry. And while they do have a reasonable amount of raw damage with their heavy bolt pistols and chainsword attacks, they don't bring interesting army rules in the same way that some of their competitors do. Say things like interesting deployment options like the Scouts or the Incursors, sticky objectives like the Intercessors, or denying deep strike like Infiltrators. You might be tempted to upgrade to Jump Intercessors as well for the plus 15 points. Being able to deep strike and move a lot faster is really quite a big deal if they're not going with a character. But overall I'd say they're a solid Space Marine infantry unit, particularly with certain characters. I've given them an 8 out of 10. Next up, we've got the big and chunky heavy intercessors. They're 100 points per 5 of them and 200 per 10, and for 20 points they have notably good defense for the cost, at 3 wounds with toughness 6, and their special rule reducing the AP of damage 1 weapons against them. Compared with the regular intercessors, their bolt rifles are longer range, with higher strength and damage 2, plus a heavy bolter into the mix as well. They get the same assault and heavy keywords, which is nice, and heavy can work with Anvil Siege Force, where they're quite a nice one. Maybe a bit more likely to survive out in the open compared with some. They've got good OC. They're interesting enough for a fair few Gravis characters, being a lot sturdier per point than the Aggressors or the Eradicators, so it could be nice enough for maybe Ironfather Phyros or Tor Garadon. I'd say they're a unit that's stronger in casual games versus competitive. They might be argued to be a bit redundant for their niches in absolutely thoroughly optimised lists, but really aren't too hard to get overall value out of with fairly punchy guns and big defensive stats. For their weaknesses, their damage output still isn't particularly good for the cost against a whole bunch of targets. Anything that's either toughness 6 or with higher saves won't be great targets for them. They kind of compare poorly to regular intercessors for most battlefield roles. Regular intercessors shoot pretty much equally hard with their double shooting rules, and they get the big draw of sticky objectives, and can also hold a point for fewer points than the heavy intercessors. They just don't have the massive durability. If you are using these to hold a home objective, you could argue that you may be overcommitting in terms of points, when you could do the job for less points with another unit that doesn't necessarily have to get in line of sight in the first place usually. You also might run the risk of being ignored or saved till last if they don't have super high damage output. It's not really a big incentive to push them towards the midboard as they're not very good in melee without a sergeant melee weapon. And with Anvil Siege Force maybe being a tempting one, it's maybe not excellent for them that it's not considered one of the strong detachments. Between all that, I think you could just make good arguments that a different unit is probably going to be the more optimal pick for whichever role you'd want to use for them. But overall, still interesting enough. Big chunky stats and able to bully enemy lighter infantry units. I've given them a 6.5 out of 10 here. I feel like you could certainly argue for it to be a bit higher though. I certainly wouldn't have been against putting them to 7 or so. Next up, we've got the standard Firstborn Space Marines with the Tactical Squad. They're 140 points for 10 Battle Brothers. You can't take squads of 5 of them, but they can split into 2 combat squads. So you can have 5 cheap bolters hold down a homeboard objective or do some screening or something, and then have the danger models put themselves to work going forward, maybe with multi-melters and melter guns and power fists and things. They're the cheapest standard Space Marine that you can get in the Codex at 14 points per model. I guess equal to the Scouts there, though they don't have a 3+ save. They're higher OC than some, and they could take Rhinos if desired, which are a fairly reasonable transport option that could deliver the bigger hitting damage dealer weapons of the squad. For weaknesses, their bolter damage is very poor compared with intercessors, and doubly so now that the intercessors gets to double their firepower. Especially on heavy weapons certainly aren't nothing, but don't really turn the entire squad around. So I'd say their biggest issue is the fact that their special rule just sort of gives them the ability that other squads have naturally to be able to be fielded in 5s, and it means that they don't have something more interesting as a draw to the unit, so the temptation is just to not to take Tactical Marines, and then say take 2 other units of Primaris that have their own individual special rules. Say for example, I feel like a squad of Intercessors and a squad of Scouts, that's only 10 points more than a Tactical squad, and I feel like that's got so much more value overall. Overall, I've given them a 5 out of 10. Either they need to be even cheaper than they are currently, or actually have an interesting datasheet rule to make them interesting. Next up, we've got the Flamethrower Space Marines from Leviathan in the Inferno squad. They're 90 points for 5 or 180 for 10, and they're pretty good at purging enemy infantry with a whole bunch of Strength 5 and AP1 Flamer auto hits ignoring cover. So genuinely pretty impressive damage output against light infantry there. I'd say perhaps their single biggest draw to them is being able to threaten some fairly punchy overwatch in the midboard. Certain lighter units that care about that damage profile aren't going to be able to advance near them without entire squads getting barbecued. They're particularly nasty in Firestorm Assault Force. That gets you to be able to advance and shoot with the flamers and help get them in range, and the Strength 6 is really nice on them as well, and Vulcan Hestan could also be an option to allow them to reroll wound rolls too. They can get seriously quite punchy against tougher targets between those. Their special rule does Battle Shock against infantry, which might occasionally prevent a stratagem or something, and I guess just for ease of access, from real world models they're super cheap to physically buy right now, due to appearing in starter sets in good numbers. For downsides, I feel like maybe one of their most obvious rivals are the regular Intercessors, which do have a similar sort of punchy anti-infantry damage output as these guys. Now they've got their double shoot rule. Between that, the squad being cheaper, coming with a power fist, having OC2 and sticky objectives, it just feels that the Inferno squads are kind of thoroughly overshadowed by the Intercessors. I feel like the only major advantage that they've got over them are some synergies, as mentioned before, plus their big overwatch. Their damage output's still not going to worry things with good saves or high toughness. They might struggle to get range on their targets outside of things like Firestorm, very short range and slow moving, with no built-in assault keyword, and maybe a little bit borderline on the expense of the units to buy in a transport. Overall not unusable, but feel a bit overshadowed by the other Space Marine units. I've given them a 6 out of 10. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor, In Titan's Terrain. If you're looking to get a Warhammer 40k battlefield on the go, then they're one option to do so, doing things a bit differently to most terrain sets out there with their pop-up cardboard terrain system. The idea behind their stuff is that you basically have a 3x4 grid of tiles, and then each tile unfolds and up pops a building. So you basically have an entire battlefield that can be stored completely flat and then set up and taken down rather quickly. That means that the entire terrain set can fit inside a box the same size as a regular board game, so it could be a reasonable choice for people who don't have a lot of storage space at home, or if you're trying to get terrain that you can take around to a friend's house or something. Storage and portability is their main selling point. I've got a few different designs of this on offer, and you can check them out, links down in the video description if you'd like to take a look. I'll also cycle back to them at the end of the video to talk through a few of their pros and cons of the terrain set versus other ones, plus a few examples of their specific sets. In any case though, a massive thank you to them for sponsoring this one. On with the Space Marine infantry though, and next up we have the Stern Guard veterans, 100 points for 5 or 200 for 10. For their strengths, they've got 3-shot devastating wound bolters within 12 inches with all of the regular intercessor keywords, a punchy sergeant with an extra attack on his power fist, and the squad all gets a pretty big flurry of strength 4 attacks as well in melee, enough to bully some lighter infantry at least, plus a heavy bolter with devastating wounds per unit. Then all that goes to the next level. If it's against the Oath of Moment target, you get to reroll your hit rolls as per normal, maybe a +1 to wound if you're playing core Codex Space Marines, and then they get to reroll wound rolls as well, which is particularly nasty with devastating wound profiles and their sort of mid to low strength melee as well, which really appreciate more wounds coming in. Perhaps the biggest thing about that though is that it can affect any attached characters, so they'll also be able to reroll all wound rolls, and that makes the squad absolutely murderous if you have something like a fighty captain attached to them. If you use his big damage turn and then attack the Oath targets, then it's going to make an enormous mess. The vast majority of attacks will be hitting and wounding if you have +1 to wound Oath on the go. If a squad with 5 Stern Guard and a captain is able to shoot and then fight all into the Oath target, they're going to cause an enormous damage on basically anything in the game. Beyond that, they can be very good in the Librarius detachment with Fusillade. Again, enormously general purpose threat with the anti-keywords thrown in. And if you're taking a small combo with a fighty character and a 5-man squad, they could be delivered out of an impulsor to keep them safe until they get into shooting them melee. For their downsides, perhaps the biggest one is that they need Oath of Moment to really get good against their target, and that is quite a big downside, as it might make more sense to put it somewhere else in the army. Basically all of the Space Marines really like re-rolling hits and +1 to wound in some way or another, so they do sort of consume the ability to use that for something else. It also might be a downside to taking multiple squads too, as usually only one's going to be able to make maximal use of destroying the Oath of Moment targets. The damage can be a bit swingy as well, and dependent on rolling 6s for devastating wounds against tough stuff, and once the enemy comes to strike back against them, they're not really all that tough for the cost at all. Still, despite that, they're a really dangerous unit, and I've given them an 8 out of 10 here. I'd be most tempted in squads of 5 with a character attached. Next up, we've got the Company Heroes. You get 4 Marines for 105 points now, and they're basically an unusually tanky Primaris command squad, 4 wound models with a -1 to wound built in, and they're usually best to guard a special character. Maybe Marnius Calgar, Uriel Ventris, or Vulcan Heston could be good examples, allowing them to get their melee profiles to good use while they're fighting in the midboard, and use any other buffs that they might have in relative safety. They also have a reliable +1 OC with the banner, and a fighty champion that can add in a bunch of damage to attacks to support whatever character they're leading. For their weaknesses, when taken alone, their damage output really isn't all that strong for 105 points. They'd probably get up to the point with an attached character where they're sort of bullying medium-style units, as opposed to being super big damage dealers that are going to be able to take down the enemy's biggest threats. Lacking an invulnerable save means that some big guns will still kill them perhaps surprisingly easily. Things like melter weapons can be quite good. They're fairly bad for a generic captain, so they need a chapter-specific choice to really make them worth it. And they don't have much choice with character selections. Some characters that might be otherwise quite good choices for them can't join them, as it has to be captains or chapter masters. Overall, between all that, I've chosen to give them a 7.5 out of 10. I feel like they are a usable unit, really quite strong with things like Marnius Calgar, but maybe a bit more dependent on the character themselves to bring the value, as opposed to bringing it quite so much. I feel like they're just a bit less efficient than they used to be when they were 95 points. Next up, we've got the Blade Guard veterans that somewhat recently dropped down to 80 points from 90 per 3 of them. For Tactica's Armoured Space Marines in the Codex, they're perhaps the best on-foot melee damage dealers, with a lot of characters that could lead them. They get a bunch of Strength 5 AP2 and Damage 2 melee, plus a bonus rule for some rerolls either to hit or to save, and that low strength but quite dangerous profile is good for a bunch of characters, say Chaplains with a +1 to wounds, Lieutenants with a lethal hits, or Adrax Agatone for rerolling wound rolls. Anything that can make them better against wounding tough stuff is nice. They may be one of the stronger choices for the Judas era as well, with the fights first on a general dangerous unit. Their durability isn't too bad given storm shields and essentially 26-point models. If you want to transport them into battle, then they could be delivered by an Impulsor or a Land Raider, or could just foot slog in an advanced and charge detachment. Anything that's a detachment that helps out with melee will help out with them as well though. They could do well with Blood Angels with the +2 strength and +1 attack. For their downsides, they are slow moving, so something to help them get into melee will be desired. And otherwise their biggest problem to solve is being good against strength 10, things like lance or lethal hits or rerolling wound rolls if they're able to get any of those. Since the points decrease though, they're looking a whole load more efficient. I've scored them an 8 out of 10 here, solid Space Marine fighting elites. Next up, we've got the Hellblasters, 110 points for 5 or 220 per 10 of them, and these guys get you some fairly general purpose plasma fire, 2 shots at strength 8, AP 3 and damage 2, very nice against standard issue Space Marines. They get both the assault and heavy keywords, which can help out quite a lot, and again they're a profile that'll enjoy anything like lethal hits or +1 to wounds save from Core Codex Oath of Moment. Things that can help them punch up against toughness 9 or better will be really big. It could be a nice option for things like a Lieutenant plus the Gladius Fire Discipline for yet more shots, or maybe Grandmaster Azrael of the Dark Angels if they enjoy his 4+ invulnerable save plus sustained hits. It could be a good choice to have jumping out of a Repulsor with its big transport capacity and ability to defend ranged units against being charged, or maybe take pot shots out of the top hatch of an Impulsor and catch the hazardous rolls on that. Overall, it makes them quite a big and easy to use unit, and their special rule only adds to that. When they get shot down, they get to take pot shots in the enemy turn, and that could be seriously powerful if they take chunks out of enemies that were just about to shoot or charge you and prevent damage. For downsides, the hazardous rolls will likely chip away at a unit even if the enemy doesn't manage to deal with them. You might slowly lose firepower even if the shoots on death could be a small silver lining. The defense when exposed is quite bad for the cost. Lots of units kill standard Space Marines fairly easily, and 22-point Space Marines aren't tough for the cost. If they're locked in combat, then that could be worse. Without a Lieutenant or Gladius or something, they don't have a native way to fall back and shoot. If they're slain in melee, they don't get their fire on death properly with their big plasma guns. Otherwise, they do have the weakness of just not being that great against tanks and monsters. If they're wounding on a 5+, they should do at least some damage, but not really enough to justify their points cost. After the latest points decreases though, I think they're looking fairly solid as a ranged damage dealer unit, certainly one that you can build a big combo around. I've given them a 7.5 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got the Firstborn Devastators, big guns for 120 points for 5 of them, or 200 points if you want the extra 5 Space Marines, though in general I've filled them in 5s. There's a few heavy weapon options that are interesting enough, quad las cannons for some long-range anti-tank, multi-melters for punchy damage up close, or maybe grav cannons which have an interesting mixed profile. And they get some inbuilt special rules to buff them with. They ignore cover if they're static, and have the option to flip a dice to a 6 with a cherub to hopefully convert 1 bit of damage at least. I've seen them used in Librarius before, where they can be interesting enough with a Librarian with las cannons for some inbuilt shooting damage, plus maybe Firestorm with multi-melters could be interesting. They'll enjoy being strength 10 and getting the assault keyword. They maybe could be an interesting option on paper for the Razorback as well, jumping out and getting some wound rerolls. For downsides, their defense is really quite bad for the cost. They've got competition with the fire support tanks for the Space Marines and the Dreadnoughts, which basically tend to have similar sort of firepower, but more durability and mobility. Never mind the other Primaris shooting units like say Eradicators and Hellblasters. The damage output drops a fair bit if needing to move, which often they will need to. Hitting on a 4+ isn't great, even if you can spare Oath of Moments. They've got slightly limited character access. They can't take Lieutenants like the Hellblasters can. And maybe their stronger detachments like Librarius, Firestorm or maybe Anvil just aren't really all that mainstream. Overall a bit stronger in their more favoured detachments. In general I've given them a 6 out of 10 though, just a bit overcosted compared with the rest in my opinion. Next up, we've got the Primaris Devastators in the Desolation Squad with their missile launchers upon missile launchers. They're 200 points for a squad of 5, so very expensive for standard issue Space Marines. They pay an enormous premium for their indirect fire, a bunch of Castellan launchers plus a Vengor launcher on the Sergeant. They've got quite a lot of copies of Blast and can do some pretty good work against lighter enemy objective grabbers and things, taking out important ones on the home field maybe. Indirect fire certainly has a value worth paying a premium for. It can just be outsized value to whittle down, say, that one unit that's hiding on an objective that's going to score a lot of victory points, or maybe just hit some super fragile damage dealers before they get to hit you. And in turn 1, you might not be able to damage anything else in the opponent army, so they might be able to get to use Oath of Moment to reroll those hit rolls and a +1 to wound potentially. Gladius could also buff them further, getting them extra AP on their shooting too. Then after several rounds of indirect fire, they can step up and use their direct fire as well, firing a bunch of super crack rockets off to be able to do some big hitting damage later in the game. Ideally, I don't think you want to expose them until late though, given how much points you pay for them. For their weaknesses, their defense is kind of spectacularly bad for the points cost. They've got Whirlwinds as a rival for indirect fire, and their damage does pay the enormous premium for firing indirect. If you want to get good value out of them, then they really need to use their limited damage very intelligently to make them really worth the premium. Maybe better in higher end competitive play as opposed to more casually. I've given them a 6 out of 10 here. Occasionally I do see playing competitive lists, though they're certainly pretty niche, and some matchups just might not have good targets for their indirect fire. For some Gravis anti-tank support, we've got the Eradicators, 100 points for 3 or 200 for 6. They're the anti-tank Primaris with absolutely enormous damage against tanks and monsters within 18 inches. They basically get 4 melter shots with 4 rerolls to hit, wound and damage. Point for points, that makes them one of the scariest damage dealers in the Space Marine army at that range, and then they get to kind of ludicrous levels if they can ever make themselves go within 9 inches. They've got detachments that can help them out quite a lot. Firestorm's good for them with strength 10 and assault keywords. Gladius can also help them get close with advance and shoot, and to get them to their targets they could potentially use a repulsor, and a pretty worthwhile value user of that. They could use strategic reserves, and maybe weirdly enough could be an interesting enough unit for Marnius Calgar to lead, getting them advance and shoot and some durability with his guard, and being able to fall back and shoot with them is pretty nice also. For their downsides, they certainly have plenty. They've not got good durability per point, even if individually per model they're fairly tough. They're short-ranged and move slowly, so you need to think about delivery, and they could get screened out of their ideal targets. The damage output is fairly poor against anything that isn't a monster or vehicle, and really quite swingy even against their ideal targets. They absolutely could wreck tanks in just one round of firepower, though they could just completely bounce or get caught by invulnerable saves. They're likely going to be close and they're maybe locked up in melee, so for detachments that can't fall back and shoot, that won't be good. And the Apothecary Biologist can be quite nice for them, though it's quite expensive as an upgrade. I feel like 70 points is pricey for what he does. Still though, they have absolutely massive damage numbers. I've given them an 8 out of 10, and pretty scary for the anti-tank role for the Marines. Next up, we've got some jump infantry, and first up there's the jump pack intercessors. 90 points per 5 of them, or 160 per 10. They're a fairly nice and general purpose unit. They move fast, so you can get around the board to skirmish with enemies, or to get to objectives. They can deep strike, so it could be an option to drop 4 secondary objectives. They've got an okay volume of attacks with a bunch with strength 4, AP 1, damage 1, so are quite nice against lighter infantry, and a couple of plasma pistols plus a power fist mean that they can threaten tough stuff, with their special rule of mortal wound impact hits, meaning that if you can get a lot of units in melee, they should be able to take off more wounds. Between all that, they're fairly solid to use for objective and skirmishing style roles, having options to do secondaries and bully their peers that are trying to do similar. The discounted big unit at 160 points is interesting enough that I have seen some people use them as sort of mainline damage dealers, maybe particularly popular to do that occasionally in Blood Angels. They do enough to take them to be more mainline threats in Liberator with a bunch of strength 6 and extra attacks. In the core codex, Kavan Shrike can be interesting too. Having lone operative on really quite a big and threatening unit can be very scary. For their downsides, they're a little expensive for secondary dropping troops at 90 points. If they just drop down, score a few victory points and then get shot down, 90 points doesn't feel like the best trade for that, and there are cheaper deep strike options. If they want to get their mortal wound damage off, then they're reliant on getting the charge and also getting several models actually into engagement range. That might not be the easiest thing in the world with longer charges and bigger units. And I do have competition for the other various Space Marine skirmishing and units for objectives, maybe things like Reavers or Inceptors for deep striking, or Scouts for starting in the midboard. Overall, I feel like they're a solid aggressive skirmishing and deep strike unit though. I've given them an 8 out of 10 here. Next up, an arrival for them at the moment, we've got the Vanguard Veterans. They're just 95 points now and do similar sort of things to the Jump Intercessors. Move fast with their jump packs with built-in deep strike and fly. They will be able to get where they need to go, and then otherwise have some side-graded rules. They get lethal hits and strength 5 rather than the mortal wound impact hits and power fist, and then a choice between a whole clutch of fancy pistols or 4+ invulnerable saves on their storm shields. So you either have a squad that can do a surprising amount of work with pistols up close, or it's going to be harder to take down in return. Again, they're nice with Kavan Shrike and Blood Angels. For downsides, they're still not really very general purpose, despite the potential for lethal hits on the charge. They don't have any good AP or mortal wounds. They're certainly going to be a lot more effective against 1-wound infantry than other stuff, and will probably still give the competition slightly to the Jump Intercessors while they're 5 points cheaper. The Power Fist, the mortal wounds, and the cheaper price tag I think overall swing it for me just about. I've given the Vanguard Veterans a 7 out of 10 though. They definitely have their strong points. Next up, we've got the Suppressors at 75 points for 3 of them. They can be a cheap deep strike unit that could do secondary objectives for a cheaper cost than Vanguard Veterans or Jump Intercessors. Then again, they move 12 inches on the board, and when they drop in, they can actually contribute fairly fully with their damage output. A whole bunch of strength 8, AP 1 and damage 2 shots with their autocannons that hand out a -1 to hit for one target that they've pinged. They do come with a bunch of downsides though. They're really quite bad defense for the cost at 25 points for standard Space Marine body. Very easy to kill by anything that looks sideways at them. The small squad size isn't going to be particularly good for a target for stratagems and things to make those autocannons hit harder. And without further buffs, the strength 8, AP 1 and damage 2 profile will underwhelm against most things, particularly if they're hitting on a 4+ on the move out of deep strike. Anything with a high save or a toughness of 9 or more isn't really going to care about the damage output all that much. Having a choice between hitting on a 4+ or moving is a little bit painful, and the debuff only functions as long as the squad is alive as well. If they're just wiped out, then the opponent could cancel it before it even takes any effect. Overall, I'd rank them as usable enough, but a bit on the niche side. I really haven't seen many people use these whatsoever in 10th edition. I think I'd argue that the other deep strike units just add a bit more than what they do, but they certainly do have some positives if you can find a way to keep them alive. I've given them a 6.5 out of 10. For some pricier deep strike specialists, we've got the Inceptors, dropping in with their Gravis armor and dual pistols. They're 120 per 3 of them, or 240 per 6. Their core datasheet rule is their meteoric descent, allowing them to drop in at just greater than 6 inches, so that basically means that the opponent's going to have a tough time screening out against them. They're going to likely be able to get into the enemy home field unless they've got a ridiculous amount of board control, and that means it could be hard to prevent them doing secondaries like behind enemy lines, or getting lines of sight to things that the opponent doesn't want shot. The damage output when they get there is pretty reasonable for the points that they pay. Either twin-linked plasma weapons with damage 3 or twin-linked bolters with damage 2, and both of which are quite balanced depending on exactly what target you want to be the biggest threat to. When they're on the board, if they do manage to survive a turn, then the pistol and assault keywords should be able to keep them firing after that. They perhaps stand out strong in Vanguard, where they've got their return to reserves rule, allowing them to jump back into the sky to maybe have another deep strike later on. You could have some pinpoint force and then move that around the battlefield, and Firestorm could be interesting enough as well with a +1 strength and a +1 to wound stratagem. That could potentially convert quite a lot of wound rolls, or they could just use Oath of Moment to double down on the damage that you pay a premium for. For downsides, once they're on the board at 40 points per Gravis profile, they're very easy to kill for their points cost. A few damage 3 shots are going to take down a lot of points worth of models. I feel like oftentimes you might have the choice between a few intelligent ways to use them, none of which really justifies the entire 120 points. Say for example doing a secondary objective for 3 victory points and shooting at a really suboptimal target, or shooting at the thing that you want to destroy the most but not doing the objective, and being in a weak position where they're going to be counter-attacked hard. They've definitely got interest with the close deep strikes though. I've given them a 7.5 out of 10. Next up we've got the Phobos infantry. First we've got the Incursors, 85 points for 5 of them and 170 per 10. They have a scout keyword, so can move into the mid-board straight away, get a few bolt shots with some helpful enough keywords, and then actually have some alright melee threat now. Games Workshop gave them extra AP with their combat knives not so very long ago, and added to their sustained hits they can bully lighter infantry, plus have a haywire mine to take one big chunk out of an enemy tank or vehicle. While they're doing that skirmishing, they can also mark one target for a +1 to hit, which could function for your whole army's firepower if you needed it to. Potentially having a bunch of a gun line affected with being very accurate indeed, maybe even 2+ to hit re-rolling ones if you're using Oath of Moment against the same target for something that you just need maximal damage against. For the downsides, you do need some ranged units to support to get maximal use out of them. The Scout's not really quite as powerful as Infiltrates for denying the mid-board, and the opponent could hem them back with their own infiltrators. There's diminishing returns on more units. You're only going to want to shoot so many things with your gun line in one turn. And if there's a bit of anti-synergy with Oath of Moment, it might just make sense to put Oath of Moment on the target that you need to hit with multiple guns, so you're already going to be hitting the vast majority of your hit rolls anyway, and going up to hitting on a 2+ re-rolling isn't the biggest jump from a 3+ re-rolling. In any case though, a small and useful unit. I've given them an 8 out of 10, perhaps wants to take just one squad of 5 on in addition to a gunline list. Next up, we've got the Infiltrators. Their partners with the Aerials are 100 points for 5 or 200 per 10. They're an interesting enough utility unit that really doesn't have much damage at all, but they pay really quite a big premium for their denying deep strike rule, meaning that you can't deep strike within 12 inches of them. That means that they've got a whole load of denial space that they can put down on the backfield, and that works against 6-inch deep strike too. So quite common to have one squad zoning out the back of the board while a lot of other units move up to press the enemy. If the opponent doesn't happen to have reserves or deep strike, then they can just be another actually infiltrating unit deploying in the mid-board. And if they go in there, they're at least a fairly sturdy unit, getting the 6+ feel no pain with their Helix Gauntlet. It means that you could play them in different ways depending on the opponent. And for other options like character attachments, maybe the most tempting might be a Phobos Librarian. He prevents the squad from being shot outside of 12-inch range. So between him and denying deep strike at 12 inches, you basically get a very hard unit to interact with at all. For downsides, they now have some solid competition with the Intercessors, which seem to be the unit that people are using more often for backfield objective grabbing, opting for the sticky objectives more so than the deny deep strike, though they both have their good advantages. Their actual damage output is really quite tiny for the cost, just not going to do anything much against anything besides light infantry. There's diminishing returns on multiple units, so most of the time it's usually just one infiltrator squad, maybe could be two if you're going heavy on them, and while the denied reserves thing can be really big against some armies, it could just be a little less relevant against certain other opponents. If you're not using reserves, then they won't care that much. Overall though, still a really powerful utility unit. I've given them an 8.5 out of 10, maybe moving down to strong but not auto-include, with changes that were made to both infiltrators and 3-inch deep strikes earlier in the edition. Next up for the Phobos Marines, we've got the Reavers. They're 80 points per 5 or 160 per 10 of these Skullmass Space Marines. They get inbuilt deep strike with their grav shoots, or they can start on the board to scout up. A battle shock in the fight phase against enemies in melee with them at -1, and a 3-inch aura of -1 OC, giving them a bit more weight and presence on mid-board objectives, kind of in a similar sort of way to troops, but they'll be better against some things, but less so against big single models with lots of OC. Their damage output isn't as terrible as it was at the start of the edition. Now they have AP -1 on their blades, and that does mean that they actually can threaten lighter infantry and chip a fair few wounds off Space Marines, even if they're still not going to be standout damage dealers. They get precision on their attacks, which can potentially help against lighter characters, though it would have to be seriously quite light characters to be too worried about their damage. And for certain built-up boards or screening ruins and things, it gets to ignore vertical movement, so if the opponent's got some space above them in a ruin or something, they could potentially jump up there as a different way to get in melee with them. Overall, they do have some interesting stuff. Their attacks are pretty limited to threaten anything with good saves or high toughness though. They do have plenty of competition. There's other deep strikers like jump intercessors, and for other board control utility units you could have scouts or incursors, and a whole bunch of their rules feel like they're situationally usable but in any one game might not come up, between the battle shock, the precision, and the -1 OC. Some of it might occasionally be really helpful, but a lot of the time not so much. Overall, I feel like with the amount of rivals that they have, I still feel like they're just a little bit overshadowed, nowhere near as much as they often have been in the past, and perhaps a squad for deep striking for secondaries and having the option to do some other fun stuff with their special rules could be interesting enough. I've given them a 6.5 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got the Phobos Snipers that are the Eliminators. They come in a squad of 3 for 85 points. They can infiltrate into the midboard, which always has good value in itself, being able to hem back enemy infiltrators and scouts, and then can blast away at the enemy with either las fusils or some sniper damage, enough to make their presence felt, but not really make them good damage dealers in their own right. Ideally, they really want to be stationary. They'll get the +1 to hit on a 2+, and devastating wounds when they're static as well, though often they're just not going to be able to afford to be. If they're static, a lot of the time they're just going to be taking firepower, and they're really quite easy to kill despite stealth, only being 85 points for a squad of 3 of them. If they can stand and shoot, I guess could be interesting for Anvil Siege Force though, potentially for a +1 to wound there. For the Sergeant, I'd be tempted to take the Instigator Carbine. That allows you to move, shoot, move, and basically means that they can pop out, do a tiny bit of damage and hide again, or just move across the board really quite quickly compared with what you might expect, getting in the right places to do secondaries or screen or move block. For their downsides, not being able to be taken in bigger units isn't great for stratagems or synergies that you might be able to put with them. Their defense is really quite poor for the cost. They've got low OC versus other skirmish and scoring style units, and they've got big competition from both scouts and infiltrators as 2 really good units for the infiltrating Space Marines kind of role. I feel like 85 points is a bit much for them really, and could do with being cheaper. Dropping down to 75 points as they were before would be a start. Overall, I've given them a 6.5 out of 10, maybe one of the most interesting things being their instigator movement shenanigans. Talking of the scouts though, they're a unit that's very hard to go wrong with in Space Marines. 75 points for 5 inductee Battle Brothers. They're a cheap infiltrate unit that can start in the midboard, again providing board control, screening, and early game objectives, and actually having a bit of damage output that could be enough to threaten lighter squads with a first turn alpha strike occasionally if it made sense. They get a heavy weapon in the unit, and their combat blades means that they can have really quite a big flurry of attacks at strength 4 and AP 1, which is enough to often deal with their rivals. Their defense isn't terrible for the cost given their 14 points, particularly with their special deployment rules. As well as infiltrates, they also have the scout keyword, which means that you could deploy them super aggressively with infiltrate and then scout them backwards to keep them safe if the opponent gets first turn. Finally, to round off a very good datasheet, they've also got their return to reserve special rule, which is really handy for doing secondaries, potentially if they survive into the late game, pulling them from the board and moving them around behind the enemy to threaten their home field. Perhaps the biggest downside is diminishing returns beyond 1 or 2 units of them, and particularly so with all the other good utility units that the Space Marines have that we've mainly already talked about. Either way though, I feel like 1 or 2 units of these guys is rarely going to be a bad choice in a Space Marine army list, just reasonably strong for what they do, great deployment options, and cheap enough to be a sacrificial unit to bait the enemy out before he hits whatever killed them extra hard. I've given them a 9 out of 10. Next up, let's talk about some chunky armoured elites. First up, we have the aggressors with 100 points for 3 or 220 per 6. They're a Primaris Danger unit with some pretty strong infantry killing range damage. A flurry of shots at strength 4 with AP -1 against the closest enemy, making them at least alright against tougher stuff, and then following that up with a bunch of melee attacks, their power fists having the twin links rule, so they're going to be able to punch up against tougher stuff a bit easier than some. To get them where they need to be, they could be jumping out of a Land Raider, and with their big dangerous stat line, they're tempting one to add other characters into. They could run with Marnius Calgar, with having his Honor Guard tank shots for them with their invulnerable saves, an Apothecary Biologist with their lethal hits helps both at range and in melee, and the Gravis Captain could be interesting enough. Perhaps a Gravis Captain with the Flamestorm Gauntlets and the Firestorm detachment could be interesting, with a whole bunch of devastating wounds on offer. For their downsides, their durability isn't particularly good for the cost. One of their best support options in the Apothecary Biologist is really expensive at 70 points for lethal hits, and they're fairly slow moving and need to be at close range, so in general they need some sort of delivery system, whether it's a weird teleporting deep strike of one sort or another, jumping out of a repulsor or a Land Raider, or using something like an infiltrate enhancement in Vanguard Spearhead to get closer. Overall, despite a recent points decrease, I still feel like they're not quite where they could do with being. I've given them a 6.5 out of 10. I think they could do with coming down just a few more points really. Next up, we've got the Space Marine Terminator Squad, 170 points per 5 or 340 per 10. They're really quite a big chunky focal unit that's good for synergies. Characters and stratagems and enhancements can go quite a long way here. They've got solid defense with 3 wounds at toughness 5, a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable. Some shooting with their Cyclone missile launchers, though maybe more notably a bunch of Storm Bolters that can clear out a lot of enemy hordes, hopefully hitting something while they go charging into something else. Fear of the Thirst gives them a further buff against the Oath of Moment target, and they've also got a Teleport Homer, which could occasionally give them a free rapid ingress, though I feel like it's got to be kind of situational as to whether or not you choose the actual right place that's going to be credible to drop for them. They're a fairly focal unit in the 1st Company Task Force as well, a lot of the buffs and synergies working better for them than anything else. For their downsides though, they're kind of jack of all trades and masters of none. Their damage output is just kind of low for the cost, both range and melee, paying for their big durability stat lines, but even then they're not so indomitable that enemy heavy firepower isn't going to take down units of them. I feel like their character support options are all a touch on the pricey side for what they bring, and once they are on the board, even after they've deep struck, they're kind of slow to be able to get where they want to. If you want to actually get them to melee as well, you'd probably be wanting to budget a command point for rapid ingress. Otherwise, there's a pretty reasonable chance they just drop at 9-inch range and then fail a charge. Between all that, they're very, very rarely seen in any sort of competitive list, even if they're at least fairly easy to use casually. They don't really hold up very well to other faction-specific Terminators out there, things like Space Wolves, Deathwing or Deathwatch, all of which can do the mainline damage threat a fair bit better. Overall, I'd give them a 6 out of 10, maybe a little bit higher if it was ranking more for casual play versus competitive. I still feel like they could either do with a rules buff of some sort or a points decrease. Otherwise, for their melee equivalents, we've got the Terminator Assault Squad. They're 180 per 5 models or 360 per 10. They're fairly similar overall to the previous, but swapping out range threat with their Storm Bolters for Storm Shields for an extra +1 wound, and then having Thunder Hammers instead of Power Fists for hitting a little bit more inaccurately but also getting devastating wounds on them. Overall, I feel like they probably win the trade-off. The extra +1 wound actually tips the balance a bit of being a fairly tanky unit, and they can still hit hard for their primary purpose in melee. They are a unit that I've at least fairly often seen fielding the big squad of them, often built around an enhancement, maybe something like a Terminator Ancient bearing the 10 Houses Bones for the Black Templars, giving them a big 5+ feel no pain, or maybe something using the Infiltrate enhancement in Vanguard, where you've got a really big, tough and threatening unit starting right in the midboard. For their downsides, they are pricier than regular Terminators. Their damage output still isn't particularly high, at least on a per model basis, though if you've got a good number of them massed up, they should be able to deal with most things in a round of melee. Again, they'll be slow on the board and wanting advance and charge on things like Gladius or Stormlance if it's on offer. Their Battleshock rule in melee isn't a particularly helpful one, even if it occasionally might be able to prevent a stratagem going off or something. And again, they don't tend to win the competition between faction-unique Terminators for the armies that have them. The Space Wolves, Deathwing and Deathwatch ones tend to do better. Overall, I've given them a 7 out of 10 though, a bit more interesting than the regular variant in my opinion, and can be nice enough with certain enhancements or maybe characters like Lysander. Moving on to the even chunkier armoured elites, next up we have the Centurion Assault Squad. They're 150 points per 3 models, waddling forward with some really big damage up close, but only going very slowly at 4 inches. If they can close with the targets though, they're going to be an enormous threat to enemy tanks and vehicles, with big hitting damage 3 siege drills. On top of that, they can have quite a lot of firepower against lighter infantry, between things like flamers or hurricane bolters. They can take twin melter guns instead of flamers too. and their stat lines are sort of middling on durability. Their toughness 7 with a 2+ save and 4 wounds, so individually really quite tanky, and small arms certainly aren't going to hurt them. But compared with tanks and vehicles, certain other things like special weapons like plasma and melter will have a much better time into them versus armoured targets. They can make good use of Armour of Contempt. The main challenge is how to get them there. They could use a Land Raider to deliver them into melee. They can fit inside a standard size one with just the squad of 3 of them. And otherwise they're going to enjoy detachments that can help increase their threat range, things like maybe Stormlance or Gladius for advance and charge potentially. For their downsides, they can't get any character synergies or enhancements as nothing can join them, so what you get on the datasheet is basically what you have. As mentioned, the right guns will take them apart quite quickly, and they're just kind of painfully slow moving and short ranged, so you would absolutely need to make sure you're investing in something to get them in close and personal, and try and put them somewhere where the opponent's not just going to be able to back away from them. I've seen them used from time to time in competitive lists, maybe a little bit on the sparing side. I've given them a 7 out of 10 here. I don't know if that's being a touch on the generous side, maybe not the worst thing to have around in a very knight heavy meta. I think I wouldn't have been against rating them a little bit lower. For their battle brothers with the big hitting firepower and their Space Marine side Space Marine battlesuits, we've got the Centurion Devastator squad. They went down to 165 points for 3 of them and 330 for 6, and they typically come loaded with Twin Links las cannons and the blast missiles on the chest, and with rerolls against things on objectives, they're a pretty scary threat against a whole bunch of stuff out there. The blast missiles really helping out against sort of medium infantry and lighter ones. They've got really good range on their firepower, so could be happy enough to inflict damage for a safe distance, provided they can get a firing lane. In particular, they really like any army that can allow them to return to reserve repeatedly, to basically turn up on the board edges and shoot the enemy very hard. Vanguard Spearhead can do that, as potentially could Death Watch, though they might want that on their own kill teams. Again, for their main downside, they're just painfully slow moving at just 4-inch move, and while they certainly have damage outputs to rival or even beat certain Space Marine tank damage dealers, they won't be anywhere near as mobile while they're doing so, and effectively the squad will degrade damage output a lot worse, because as you start to lose models, you'll lose entire guns, as opposed to a tank that might just be -1 to hit or something. Otherwise, like the others, they can't have characters join them. The durability is not great against things like special weapon fire or other mid-strength melter type things. They certainly don't want to get tagged in melee if they can avoid it, which might stop their guns firing unless they happen to be in a detachment with fallback and shoot. Overall, I feel like they're interesting enough, a lot stronger in detachments with a return to reserve like Vanguard. Still could be usable as a fire-based unit elsewhere though. I've given them a 7 out of 10. Moving on, we've got the Space Marine bike and mounted units. First up, the Outrider squad is 80 points for 3 or 160 for 6. These guys move fast at 12 inches and are fairly good at bullying sort of enemy lights to medium infantry with a bunch of bolt shots with damage 1 and then chainsaws that get +1 strength and damage on the charge, so they can take a chunk out of standard size Space Marine squads. For a fast moving 80 point unit, their OC to tip objectives isn't terrible, with OC 6 beating a lot of common 5 model units out there. The defense is pretty good for the cost relative to a bunch of skirmish units. 4 wounds at toughness 5 definitely isn't terrible on that front, and certain chapters and detachments can make better use of them. They've got some cool stratagem options in Stormlands, maybe particularly the -1/2 hit and wound against shooting could allow them to survive unexpectedly, and they're good for the Dark Angels as well, fielded as battle line troops in company of hunters if you want to, and could be very nice with Samael as well, giving you a fighty character that really likes the +1 damage on the charge. For their downsides relative to other fast skirmishing units like the Jump Intercessors, they've got the mounted keyword and need to go around terrain as a result. That can slow them up to perhaps a slightly surprising extent. They're still very slanted towards hurting lighter infantry as opposed to tougher stuff, and overall they're just not quite threatening enough to really be optimal, with the chaplain making them a damage dealer style unit. He definitely helps them out against tougher things with devastating wounds and +1 to wounds, but overall it just doesn't seem to quite add up to be regularly worth it. Overall I feel like they're usable enough, generally in small units of 3 as a support unit style role. I've given them a 7 out of 10. For the sort of updated attack bike that became the Primaris Mario Kart buggy, we've got the Invader ATV. This one's 60 points for a 1 model unit, a cheap and expendable unit that can move really quite fast, and quite nice as a sacrificial unit for Space Marines in particular. You can zoom it onto the mid-board objectives and then not worry too much if it dies, and the opponent's still going to have to put some effort into bringing it down, as it's got 8 wounds at toughness 5. It's not a complete pushover against a volley of small arms or anything. It does have a little bit of threat with a multi-melter and its return fire special rule. I feel like I've seen a few more Dark Angels use these compared with most, with things like Company of Hunters or Wrath of the Rock with the -1 to wound helping out its role quite well, and potentially some Raven Wing style synergies in certain detachments. For downsides, its damage output per point is pretty bad, but that's not really the main point of it. You can't take it in bigger units if you want to. So despite having a heavier gun, it isn't ever really going to be a mainline damage dealer with big synergies for a biker mounted force. It doesn't have a lot of OC if it's moving on to an objective. A small squad of enemy infantry could take that objective straight off it. Overall, an interesting enough outlying expendable unit for the Space Marine armies though. I've given it a 7 out of 10. Next up, we've got the Tech Marine crude support piece that is the Firestrike servo turret, 75 points each or 150 for 2 of them. This one gives you some ballistic skill 2+, anti-tank or anti-elite firepower with its las talons. Its damage output genuinely isn't awful. And for other advantages, it also has a 4+ overwatch, which is alright, though I think you need 2 Firestrike turrets to really justify that. One of them just doesn't really make the 1 command point worth it even with that boost. Some detachments could help it out as well, maybe Ironstorm for single rerolls, or Firestorm to allow it to move itself around just that little bit weirdly faster with the advancing. This one definitely comes with some big trade-offs though. Only being strength 10 stops it being all that effective against toughness 11 or more, even with twin links. The biggest one really is the durability though. Only a 3-inch move means that it's virtually immobile. It's unlikely to be able to hide and then pop out for firing lanes particularly easily. It's not going to be able to push up to bits of cover to see around them like tanks can. And if it gets engaged in melee, it might struggle to even fall back if it wants to. The 2+ save isn't terrible, but it is still easier to kill than most tanks and vehicles, with only toughness 6. It maybe feels like Anvil Siege Force should be the spiritual home of it, but it's not got the heavy keyword and already hits on a 2+. And between all that, it just feels like it's overshadowed both by tanks and vehicles, which do a similar job but better, and also infantry, which have their own advantages and more synergies. And then if you want some more static fire support that hits things hard, I'd probably go with the Devastator Centurions before this. Even with all that, I still don't think they're completely unusable, but they do feel suboptimal compared with basically any of those others. I've chosen to give them a 4 out of 10 here. Moving on to vehicle units next, and first up we'll start with Dreadnoughts and Walkers. The standard firstborn Dreadnought perhaps having the roughest time of it here. 135 points for a 8 wounds toughness 9 Walker with a 2+ save. Its main advantage is giving an aura of reroll 1s for nearby infantry, and then a little damage output with a single heavy weapon, plus an alright threat in melee with a bunch of power fist attacks that hits as hard as a Redemptor. That's mainly where the good stuff ends though. It's incredibly slow with the movement, with only 6 inches. Most of the other Dreadnoughts that have had updated rules have been boosted with that, but it got its datasheet really early in the edition. It means that it's just kind of unlikely to meet melee with anything that doesn't want it to be in melee. The infantry buff means that you're going to want likely some longer range shooting infantry. I guess could be okay with Hellblasters, but they might just be using Oath and Moment anyway and make the buff redundant. And even if not, then the reroll 1s to hit isn't exactly a spectacularly powerful buff. Neither its range and melee damage output is particularly impressive for the points cost. It's not got good defense for the points either, basically being easier to kill than the vast majority of tanks that are a similar sort of points level. Overall, this one just costs far more points than it should. I feel like you probably have to be dropping it down to somewhere nearer the 100-point mark before people start being interested in it. They have been doing that recently with a bunch of the Chaos Space Marine Hellbrutes. Maybe could have some sort of interest in a really infantry heavy build, but otherwise pretty standout bad. I've given it a 3 out of 10. Next up, we've got the big and chunky Redemptor Dreadnought. This one's the most expensive of the Space Marine Dreadnoughts in Codex at 210 points, being extra indomitable compared with most of them, having -1 damage, so particularly damage 2 and damage 3 weapons are going to have a really rough time taking wounds off it, with a good number of wounds at toughness 10 and a 2+ save, and the potential for Armour of Contempt on a vehicle that could certainly justify it. Its range damage is at least fairly general purpose. The big Macroplasma Incinerator is better against elite infantry, though can take chunks out of heavies, then has a bunch of small arms to shred some hordes beyond that. The Plasma Incinerator profile does quite like boosted Oath of Moment. Getting a +1 to wound makes it much more general purpose against tough stuff. It does have some threat in melee with a bunch of strength 12 and damage 3 attacks, but maybe not its standout thing. It's really quite easy to use and flexible, a big thing to march up the board and force the opponent to deal with, and it enjoys some things like Ironstorm Spearhead with good stratagems there, and it's quite a nice one to support with Tech Marines and healing, in particular because the wounds are harder to take off than normal with the -1 damage. It means that you get excess value from restoring those wounds. For downsides though, its range damage just isn't quite as strong as a lot of other competitors and is a bit random. Having a big d6 to roll for the number of shots doesn't help with that, plus being reliant on wounding on 5s a good bit of the time. And between all of its abilities, it's kind of a jack of all trades and master of none, and pays a big points premium for that. It is durable against some things, but less so against others. Some really big, high strength, high damage, high AP things could go through the Redemptor not all that much harder than certain other tanks out there. Maybe stuff like Tau Railguns or Gladiator Lancers, for example. Overall, I'd rate it as a unit that's maybe slightly better in casual play versus competitive play. Not that it's terrible there. but just maybe a bit unsubtle with its marching forward durability, and seeing if the opponent can deal with it. Overall, I've given it a 7.5 out of 10. Next up, for the melee version of the Redemptor, we've got the Brutalis. This one's 160 points, though it doesn't have the big -1 to damage rule. Still though, given the points being so much cheaper, it's fairly tanky. Its main purpose is to reach melee, where it gets 6 attacks with twin links at strength 12, plus a whole bunch of mortal wound impact hits. I feel like more people tend to take the Talon, so it's got a sweet profile as opposed to the Fist. It does have a little range threat as it moves in with a twin multi-melter. Potentially that could hit quite big, as it is likely to get in range, and could be one that gets on particularly well with detachments that allow it to advance and charge, perhaps Gladius Task Force, or could even be one to rapid ingress on the flanks if you fancy it. For its downsides, it's just very dependent on actually reaching melee to have value. A big ground-bound melee vehicle that's got to move around terrain is quite likely to be exposed and taking some damage before it makes combat with something that the opponent doesn't want it to, and that makes it just maybe a little bit more predictable and manageable compared with some other Space Marine threats. Overall, I'd still say that at 160 points it's not super standout in terms of Space Marine damage dealers, and likely to get overshadowed by other things, though I have seen them used in competitive lists from time to time. I've given it a 6.5 out of 10 here. If I'd been generous, I might have given it a 7. Then for the last mainline Redemptor chassis, we've got the Ballistus Dreadnought, the new one from the Leviathan box set with the big las cannons and missile launchers. This guy's 140 points for essentially the same stat line, so for per point durability is even tougher. Again, it'll quite get on with Armour of Contempt and cover saves. It's got long range damage output that can handle heavies fairly well, inbuilt rerolls against things that haven't taken damage too much. That means that it might not be as reliant on Oath of Moment compared with some units, and it can flex out the missiles for some anti-infantry style damage if the thing that it needs to do this turn is to take down some hordes. These things are just really quite general purpose and quite common to see added in alongside just about any Space Marine list, just to provide some range threat for something that the opponent's going to struggle to deal with. Often run as a pair in support to have the chance to be able to roll well enough to take down an enemy vehicle in a turn with a good round of shooting. For downsides, it isn't the single biggest hitting damage dealer of the Space Marines. Other things will be more dangerous, but it does pay a small premium for its durability, which isn't too unexpected. The rerolls won't stack with Oath of Moment ones, which could be a downside compared with things like Vindicators, and the Strength 10 missiles mean that this thing won't be quite as solid against things like Knights with Toughness 11, at least compared with other dedicated anti-tank like Gladiator Lancers or Vindicators. It's still a really solid and scary gun turret though. I've given it an 8.5 out of 10 here. Lastly, for the Space Marine Walkers, we've got the Invicta Tactical Warsuit. This one's 125 points, so a fair bit cheaper than the Dreadnoughts. This guy gets a fairly big scout move, so can potentially outmaneuver the enemy's turn 1, maybe jumping into a mid-board ruin or going on the offensive if it gets first turn. You then either get the autocannon for some somewhat punchy damage 3 attacks with twin linked, or an incendium cannon that could allow some big overwatch. Its melee for some reason is a bit punchier than the average Dreadnought, with strength 14 versus strength 12. And its special rule is to return fire against something that just shot a Phobos unit, which occasionally could be really quite meaningful, though it would have to be against the right target. Its damage output is only really particularly interesting against lighter enemy infantry units at range. That's certainly one of the weaknesses. It's not particularly strong against tough stuff, and even in melee it's probably not going to get too many wounds punched through even against tough enemy vehicles. Between AP2 and hitting on wounding on a 3+, you're probably going to drop a fair few attacks. Its durability isn't particularly standout, with only toughness 8 and 12 wounds and a 3+ save. It's got to fear things like Melter Plasma and Strength 10 weapons a lot more than other battle tanks, and overall it feels like there's quite a lot of onus to get some good value out of its scout moves, as that feels like it's what it's paying the premium for. Overall I've given it a 6 out of 10, very rarely seen in competitive lists, though not completely unheard of. I think someone won a tournament with them in the not so very distant past. In general though, it just feels a bit behind the other Space Marine damage and defense style units. Moving on to some more mainline battle tanks though, and first up we have the Predator. The Annihilator is 135 points with its big las cannons, the Destructor with its autocannon 140. Both are fairly cheap and effective gun turrets against their chosen targets, boosted by hunter-killer missiles and some small arms popped on the top. The Annihilator gets its big twin-linked las cannon turret at strength 14, and all its las cannons get to reroll damage rolls against monsters and vehicles, so a bit less likely to need to burn command rerolls there. The Destructor gets its autocannon with a bunch more shots, rapid fire outs to 24 inches and extra AP against infantry. Overall it's really quite a general purpose threat, both against sort of medium and lighter infantry, and also still lightly taking a couple of las cannons to punch up against vehicles. Both of them really enjoy the Ironstorm Spearhead and the rerolls. For downsides, after the points increases for these guys, the numbers just feel a little outcompeted by the other Space Marine choices, maybe Ballistas Dreadnoughts and Vindicators in particular, though also Repulsor Executioners and Gladiator Lancers, and they are cheaper than a bunch of those as well, so might be a bit less efficient for stratagems and synergies. Still really not bad though, very usable. I've given them a 7 out of 10, and I'd likely be more tempted to field an Ironstorm Spearhead than elsewhere. Talking of the Vindicator, and the Firstborn Siege tank is 185 points, and this guy puts out a whole bunch of anti-tank shots, D6 plus 3, strength 14, AP 3 and damage D6 1 specifically, out to a range of 24 inches. The blast keyword makes it a bit more relevant against heavier infantry and not just tanks and vehicles, and with a fairly basic profile it works quite well with damage buffs, things like Incursors to hit on a 2+, Oath of Moment for the big rerolls, maybe the Combi Weapon Lieutenant's buff. Quite a lot of things that could stack on this. Its durability with its toughness 11 and a 2+ save is pretty nice if it can get cover. Could be a hard tank to take down with smoke or armour of contempt on the go as well. It can maybe afford to be a little bit more aggressive than certain Space Marine tanks, as it can fire into engagement range and not take any penalties from big guns never tire while it's doing so. Again, like most vehicles, it'll really enjoy Ironstorm Spearhead, the single rerolls and the stratagems can be justified on it, though it is one of the ones that seems to be just basically good anywhere. For weaknesses, it is a touch pricier than most tanks. It is fairly swingy damage output with D6 plus 3 shots and D6 damage. The overall output is quite good, but it might swing really high or really low. It's more inflexible than some tanks without option to divide fire. A slightly shorter range could also limit its choice of targets as well. Only being out to 24 inches might be out of range of some of the most valuable tanks in the backfield. Overall, it's a solid and scary fire support piece though. I've given it an 8.5 out of 10. Next up, we've got the Space Marine Artillery tank in the Whirlwind, which is a slightly astronomical 190 points. For that investment, its Vengeance launcher gets indirect fire and shoots at D6 plus 3, strength 8, AP 2 and damage 2 shots. Really quite good at threatening things like enemy Space Marines, amongst others. As with the Desolation squads, it could use Oath of Moment to reroll those hit rolls, even if it's hitting on a 4+, and get a +1 to wound. Fairly punchy firepower for things that it can't see. And indirect firepower is always worth quite a big premium, being able to destroy enemy objective grabbers that it can't see, or potentially stack damage on units where it's going to be absolutely most painful, or finish off critically injured things. It doesn't need to expose itself to enemy fire while it's doing so, though I guess could do so late game if it makes sense, if it needs more direct damage and more of it, or firing a hunter-killer missile. And it's also got a battle shock rule which occasionally could have some use, maybe preventing a defensive stratagem or something like that. For downsides though, without Oath of Moment support it's not going to be doing too much to toughness 9 or more. Its damage output is just painfully low for the points that it costs. It's not unexpected to pay more for indirect fire, but it's at the point where very few people use it as a result. Battle shock that gets handed out in your turn doesn't tend to be very meaningful. I'd say with indirect fire things, they're likely to have less value in more casual play games versus big thinking competitive ones, and I feel like artillery often tends to be at the level where it might make more sense to take multiple of them as opposed to just one. One can still have some good value, but having multiple might mean that you're actually threatening to outright delete enemy units turn after turn, but that could also be a huge commitment to an army list that you'd have to play very carefully. Overall not completely unusable, but at a very high points cost. I've given it a 4.5 out of 10. I'd probably rate Desolation squads as above this for the indirect fire roll for the Marines just about. Next up, we've got the Primaris Hover Predators in the Gladiator series of tanks. They're all 160 point vehicles with toughness 10 and a 3+ save. The Lancer is the anti-armor version of it, getting 2 shots with its big hitting laser destroyer at strength 14, AP 4 and damage D6 plus 3. Its datasheet rule just makes those shots super reliable, re-rolling a single hit, wound and damage roll per activation. So it's got a pretty good likelihood of making the enemy have to take 2 invulnerable saves, and for damage that goes through it's likely to be at least fairly high with the reroll. It's also got some supporting fire weapons to help thin out some infantry nearby, and it's quite nice that it doesn't need any help from Oath of Moment. You can use that somewhere else in lists with gladiators. It could get on particularly well with the Space Wolves Iron Priest, giving that scary laser destroyer rapid fire for 3 shots rather than 2, and Black Templars could be tempting with its bolt-on multi-melter. For downsides, it's not quite as tough compared with several competitors, things like Ballistas Dreadnoughts or Vindicators. It's not very general purpose, really dedicated to tank destroying, so against armies with more elite infantry or light infantry, it's not going to be so useful. High invulnerable saves can make it a good choice to reroll the save against, so shooting into a 4+ invulnerable might prompt a command reroll and have a good chance to negate damage, and while it doesn't need buffs, it also can't receive buffs very well. If you do wind up using Oath of Moment against its target, it just won't have quite as much impact as there was a pretty reasonable chance that you might have converted both hits anyway. Overall, it's a very strong, scary and long-range anti-armor unit though. I've given it an 8 out of 10 here. For its anti-infantry counterpart, that's the Gladiator Reaper. This one gets a twin heavy onslaught Gatling cannon, so a whole bunch of twin linked shots with devastating wounds and getting sustained hits too against infantry. Naturally, it absolutely goes through light infantry incredibly fast, but the devastating wounds and twin links together actually makes it pretty efficient against Terminator equivalents too. Between the sheer amount of stat saves and the ones that go through automatically, I think it kills around about 2 Terminators without further buffs. It quite likes the critical hits 5+ option from Ironstorm in particular, and could be a good option to flex into it if you happen to be matched against a fairly horde style list and you desperately need some things to clear out enemy infantry. For downsides, it's got limited damage against enemy heavies. It won't do nothing thanks to devastating wounds and twin links, but it's still going to be far less efficient against them. And a lot of Space Marine units tend to be kind of alright against infantry anyway, so there might not be so much need for a dedicated anti-horde tank. It could depend a fair bit on the actual army list that you're going for. For a vehicle-heavy Ironstorm list, it might just be absolutely paramount that you clear enemy infantry absolutely as soon as they're exposed, otherwise they're just going to be outscoring you and gumming up your vehicles. It might also be a bit meta-dependent as to how often you run into enemy infantry-heavy lists versus vehicle-heavy ones. Overall, it's definitely good enough for its job though. I've given it a 7.5 out of 10. Might be one just to take one off potentially though, due to being rather specialist. Finally for the Gladiators, we've got the Valiant, also 160 points, and this one's the close range mid-strength one, a twin las talon on the turret, and then a bunch of multi-melter shots on the sponsons. Ideally it really wants to be within 18 inches to get the multi-melters firing, and even more so within 9 inches if possible for the +2 damage on them. Its special rule gives it a +1 to hit against the closest monster and vehicle with the las talon. It might particularly enjoy advance and shoot style attachments such as Gladius to help it get in range, or potentially Firestorm, which would also be useful for strength 10 and 11 on its main weapons. That makes it significantly scarier. The Black Templar variant might also be fairly tempting as well, costing an extra 10 points but adding an extra multi-melter, so doubling down on its main purpose. I feel like numbers wise it's really unimpressive outside of 18 inches, kind of okay within 18 and only gets super impressive within 9 with the big melter damage. It doesn't really have the durability to want to be this close on the front line, and it's quite an expensive tank to zoom up the board and then have the enemy hit it maximally hard in return. Originally they had them different costs for a bit and then decided to raise this one so it's just the same as the other Gladiators. I don't know if they just wanted them all to cost the same for neatness, though I certainly feel that this one should be cheaper than the other ones. Overall I've given it a 6 out of 10. It does genuinely have some scary damage output, though I feel like it costs too much for what it does, and particularly versus the other ones. Next up we've got the Land Raider variants. They're between 220 and 280 points for the enormous Space Marine armoured bulkheads. Their primary purpose is to have a massive transport capacity and deliver units into melee with their assault ramps. Any high value Space Marine melee combo is going to find that interesting. Things like Blade Guard with characters, maybe Assault Centurions, Aggressors with characters, or various chapter specific units or combos. Then for the different variants they have some pros and cons. For their damage, the Redeemer is the most dangerous but also the most expensive with the great big Flamestorm cannons. The Overwatch is pretty fearsome with that thing though, and it can clear out entire squads of Space Marines. The Crusader's the cheapest at 220, and that basically just gets anti-infantry damage. They should at least stack a fair few staves. And then there's the scary quad las cannons of the regular more Godhammer pattern, that's 240, though it does come with the downside of being only a 10-inch move compared with the 12 of the other two. They are nice and durable with a big 16 wounds, a 2+ save, and are going to be seriously hard to take down with cover and then either Armour of Contempt or Smoke. And there's plenty of detachments that could have good uses for them, perhaps Gladius, Firestorm or Ironstorm, or having some advantages for big vehicles, and the Land Raider Redeemer in particular could work well with Vulcan Hestar or the Salamanders. For their downsides, a massive tank can mean that their footprint could make them hard or impossible to hide, particularly if they want to be moving up promptly past ruins. They are likely going to need to tank some damage on that big profile. Terrain could mess with their threat range, potentially could have things charging off a good 20 or 22 inches out of the tank, though if they have to move sideways around terrain for a bit before they drop things, then it could slow them down quite a touch. For most of the Tacticus armoured things, they could potentially fit small combo units in an impulsor, say for example Black Templar Sword Brethren or Blade Guard Veterans. You don't get the assault ramp, but you still get the +3 inches to your threat range if they're jumping out of it. And the transport capacity itself could be a problem for some combos with some Land Raiders. For example, if you want Aggressors with a character they can't go in the Godhammer variant. Overall, certainly strong and scary big investment transports though. Certainly not used in every list, but justifiable if you want one. I've given them a 7 out of 10 overall. I'd probably rate the Redeemer as my favourite one. Then for the Primaris big investment transports, we've got the Repulsor and I guess the Repulsor Executioner. The regular repulsor is 180 points, that's got a big transport capacity of 14, and for the points cost it's pretty tough. 16 wounds at toughness 12 isn't bad for 180. Damage output maybe isn't its main thing, though it does have a fair bit of threat in its own right. Some las cannons, a defensive array, plus either a las talon or heavy onslaught Gatling cannon, both of which have their draws. Though mainly it's meant to be a transport that can move up a big shooting combo into the fight, perhaps being particularly nice for delivering things like Hellblasters or Aggressors with characters, or maybe Sternguard and Librarius. It could be interesting for Aggressors or Infernus Marines in Firestorm as well. Hopefully the tank moves up, the ranged units jump out and inflict some maximal damage, and then if anyone tries to charge them they can jump back into the tank with its special rules, potentially being able to do it all over again next turn. I feel like it's perhaps notably strong for Firestorm, having a lot of options with transport shenanigans. For the downsides, its damage output is okay but not standout. I think you do need a central shooting damage combo to really justify it, and might have some competition with both Land Raiders and Impulsors. Even for shooting combos, I've seen some people use the Land Raider Redeemer for that, and for smaller units, Impulsors could work okay, though I feel like they both have a bit more natural synergy with melee damage dealers. Overall though, it feels like the Repulsor is solid enough for what it does. I've given it a 7.5 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got the one with the big gun mounted on top with the Repulsor Executioner. This one either adds an enormous laser destroyer or a macroplasma incinerator. I've seen more people going for the laser destroyer, though with +1 to wound oath the macroplasma isn't terrible, and then backs that up with plenty of shots to clear out enemy infantry between the Gatling cannon, heavy bolters and defensive array. It's got a small transport capacity that could have some value, maybe jumping a small squad of Eradicators out of it if you wanted, and it perhaps feels particularly stand out in Ironstorm Spearhead, where its big expensive points cost can make it really quite nice for stratagem support, plus the laser destroyer enjoys the rerolls, and could be quite nice with a tech marine as well. Having this much threat is enough to justify for the +1 to hit and healing. For downsides, at 220 points and only a 3+ save, it's not really got standout durability, and it is going to be attracting the biggest and scariest anti-tank weapons that the opponent's got. The special rule is a bit weak and kind of rarely takes effect. It does have competition from the other ranged damage dealers, plenty of the Space Marine ones being really well balanced. I'd say the Repulsor Executioner's got enough threats to make itself worthwhile, though plenty of people prefer things like the Ballistus Dreadnoughts or Vindicator. Overall though, I think it's a strong tank. I've given it an 8 out of 10. Lastly, for the battle tank kind of section, we've got the really big chunky grav tank in the Astreus. This one's the Primaris Super Heavy, clocking in at a massive 525 points. It's got a big macro accelerator cannon with twin links that's fairly general purpose, plus some savage sponsons, and with an enormous defensive and damage profile, it's going to be great with any buff and stratagem that you can give it. A Tech Marine to make it hit on a 2+ seems auto-include, and then likely Ironstorm Spearhead to support it as maximally as possible. For overall damage and defense for the points cost though, its numbers just don't add up too great. You're likely to get a lot more value from multiple smaller units. You could say get 2.5 Repulsor Executioners for that points cost pretty much, or around about 3 Vindicators. The main gun is certainly punchy, though the AP one I think really lets it down. If it's firing against a 2+ saving cover, it's just not going to do very much at all. And its enormous physical profile can mean that you can't move it through certain gaps on the board. If you're playing on a table with preset terrain, then there might be areas of the board that it can't even go into. It kind of feels like Games Workshop should hand out these smash through walls Knight style rules to a bunch more super heavies. It'd make them a lot better to move around the table. Overall though, it maybe could be more durability than certain enemy armies could handle if they've not optimised for anti-tank, but even so I feel like you're going to be far better off with multiple smaller vehicles. I've only given this one a 4 out of 10. Next up we've got the Speeders and Flyers, and starting with the 3 variants of Storm Speeder. The Thunderstrike is 150 points, and this one's the one that hits on a 2+ with a bit of anti-tank shooting between its las talon and missiles. Fairly comfortable to hover around at longer range if it wants to, and its primary debuff that it gives is a +1 to wound against a monster or vehicle, so it could make a lot of mid-strength things punch up far better than otherwise. It maybe could be most useful for armies like Deathwatch with a bunch of fairly scary mid-strength firepower, or Dark Angels perhaps with Hellblasters. The main issue with it for more Codex Space Marines is that it overlaps with the boosted Oath of Moment with a +1 to wound on it, and you can't have both at once, so if you're firing against one central target that the other gun line wants to destroy, then it might just be redundant to having Oath of Moment and its debuff not matter at all. That could be even more common in Guilliman lists if you're having potentially 2 copies of Oath of Moment in a turn if you can destroy the first. Otherwise it's very fragile for the points cost and doesn't have particularly good damage output, so it really is leaning on that debuff rule being the main reason to use it. Even for the armies that can make good use of it though, it's still matchup dependent. If you're playing an opponent without monsters or vehicles in their army, then its main purpose is going to be wasted, and in that case you might have gone with another damage dealer instead. Overall, I've given it a 7 out of 10, though I'd say that's primarily for the armies that don't have +1 to wound at the moment, and a bit less so for core Codex Space Marines. Next up, we've got the Stormspeeder Hammer Strike. This one's 25 points cheaper, and for the damage of this one, it gets its supercrack launchers, some missiles, and then a trio of melter shots out to 18-inch range. It'll be fairly fast to get those guns into close range if it wants to. It is a fair bit cheaper than the Thunderstrike, and its debuff is to remove the benefit of cover from one enemy unit, which really can help quite a lot with focusing fire against high save targets. Enemy vehicles and Terminators won't enjoy that. For downsides, it does need a bunch of other firepower units to really justify using its debuffs. It's still got kind of lowest durability with only toughness 9, even if it does cost a lot lower for that same profile versus the Thunderstrike. And between wanting to get close and having low durability, there's a pretty good chance it's going to get hit back very hard the next turn. Still though, stripping cover can be quite a big deal against certain big tough enemies and help amp up the Space Marine gun line that can already hit one enemy unit with a lot of might. I've given this a 7 out of 10. Finally, for the Storm Speeders, we've got the Hail Strike. This one's cheaper still at 115 points, and it's the anti-infantry one, spamming out a lot of damage one-shots with AP 0. The debuff for this one is maybe a little bit frustrating, really great with making extra AP happen against the thing that it targets, but it only works against things that aren't monsters or vehicles, so in certain games it's going to be really strong and very meaningful, as that buff's excellent against things like Terminator equivalents, but in some games it's going to be almost completely useless. Otherwise, it does have the advantage of being cheaper than the other Storm Speeders, I suppose. For the downsides, the biggest one is that it only has a flurry of Strength 4 and Strength 5 attacks to hit the enemy with. Most of those are AP 0 as well. So besides light infantry, most things just aren't going to care about the actual damage output of this. Maybe to the point where even if its debuff is working in a big way, you might still have been better off in investing in another scary damage dealer with a lot of AP and damage. Otherwise, just being so matchup dependent isn't really great news for it. Overall, I've given it a 5 out of 10 as a result. I feel like maybe if it had a bit more of a general purpose damage output in itself, then the special rule might be a bit more palatable. Particularly with Knights stomping around in the meta quite so commonly at the moment though, it doesn't feel like it's the way to go. I've given it a 5 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got the Space Marine Flyers. The big one is the Storm Raven gunship. 280 points for a mini Thunderhawk basically. Quite tough on an individual model basis. 14 wounds with toughness 10 and -1 damage, but when that's for 280 points it's really not that impressive. At least not without further buffs to toughness, say stacking Armour of Contempt on it, maybe using things like the Dark Angel's Dark Shroud Landspeeder, or maybe using the -1 to hit and wound stratagem from the Stormlance. For its damage output, it's got a fair bit of general purpose threat, a couple of punchy turret guns plus the missiles, and the Hurricane Bolters can clear out some enemy chaff units, and then its main trick is to transport a Dreadnought and a squad into battle, moving forward 20 inches turn 1 if it wants to, and then jumping out the Dreadnought and the squads to deal a great big alpha strike alongside the Storm Raven's own damage output. For the profile it has, it does actually have some good synergy with a few detachments. The Stormlance, as mentioned, with the -1 to hit and wound thing. The Firestorm one could be good for transported units, and Ironstorm Spearhead is good for any big high investment vehicle units as well. The Storm Raven no exception there. The biggest downside for it is that it was quite usable before, but Games Workshop seems to have repeatedly increased the points cost in their efforts to make all flyers super niche. And that just means that its overall damage and defense is really quite painfully low for the points cost. So you're really paying for the big premium for the Alpha Strike and hoping that the other units can make up the value. If it somehow manages to get shot down before it's delivered its payload to the front lines as well, then it's going to be rather a disaster. Potentially some powerful units that aren't getting as close as they need to. Overall, I've given it a 5 out of 10. Kind of a shame that it's got an interesting enough datasheet, but costs too much for the vast majority of people, even if occasionally skilled players manage to make it work in competitive lists. For the other Space Marine flyers, we've got the Stormhawk and Storm Talon. There are 155 points for the Interceptor and 165 points for the gunship. Fairly fast aircraft that are easy to get lines of sight. The Storm Talon gunship can start on the board with the hover keyword, the Interceptor having to go in aircraft mode and basically turn up from reserves where it will be able to use its aircraft keyword to see over obscuring ruins, which can potentially allow it to draw some more interesting lines of sight if you can physically get the line of sight, but it will just be the ruin rule preventing you from being able to shoot its targets. Overall for both of these though, the durability is really quite bad for the points. If they are staying in aircraft mode, then they've got to start off the board and have their locked flight path when they arrive from reserves, and their damage output is just kind of so-so. Not really good enough to justify the negatives and limitations. Like the Storm Raven, they're also OC0 and locked out of many secondary objectives too. Quite a further big downside if they happen to be one of the units that's left on the board. Overall, I've given them a 4 out of 10. They just seem to be solidly behind the other Space Marine tanks and damage dealers, not gaining quite enough from their mobility to make them worth it, I think. Finally, for the flyers and aircraft, we've got the really big one in the Thunderhawk gunship. This one's a pretty crazy and whopping 840 points worth of Space Marine iconic flyer, an enormous and expensive Forge World model that does have some hefty firepower with a pretty dangerous main gun, a bunch of missiles and supporting guns, and then can deliver really quite a lot of units out of its front hold, potentially getting a whole bunch of squads right up to the front of the enemy army to strike them hard. Its defensive profile is pretty tough and intimidating. Most enemy armies are at least going to have to take a couple of turns to bring the thing down, even if they're focusing a bunch of anti-tank firepower on it, particularly with Armour of Contempt. But realistically, like the Astrius, it's just going to be far better to take a whole bunch of smaller units which will have more overall value. Overall, they'll have way more damage defense and utility, as it does have a fair bit of threat, but just nothing to really justify 840 points. Again, being an aircraft and OC0 doesn't help with it too much. It'd be even more painful at 2000 points level, where it's making up almost half your army. As a result, I've given this one a 2 out of 10, just overall not very efficient for the points cost. Next up, we've got the Space Marine transport vehicles, and starting with the trusty Rhino, 75 points for a dedicated transport with a 12 model hold. It's really quite tough for the cost and has auto repair, gets a little bit of small arms plus a hunter killer missile to deal a tiny bit of damage, but maybe more of a positive that it doesn't wind up paying for extra guns on the top that you might not necessarily need or want. If you did want a bit of firepower and things were embarked, things can fire out of the top hatch via its firing points. It's probably got maximal value for the Death Watch, as the Death Watch veterans can jump into it, and they're a solid and scary close-range damage dealer unit that's not really all that tough for the cost, so definitely one that can have good value with a Rhino to get them up the board in safety, and potentially extend their threat range when they wind up jumping out of it by jumping 3 inches out of the front. In the core codex though, I'd say its main weakness is that it's just got nothing particularly exciting to transport. It'd either be Tactical Marines or Devastators. Tactical Marines maybe being one of the most obvious fits, with special weapons and las cannons that could be firing out of the top of it as it moves up, but just overall kind of a low value unit to be moving around in the first place and buying in a transport for. The Devastators could enjoy getting multi-melters up close and again make use of the hatch, though might be tempted to take the Razorback for its reroll buff. Overall, it's in a weird spot where the Rhino is absolutely not a bad unit in any way, shape or form. It's just prevented from rolling with the vast majority of the Primaris units via keywords currently, and as a result just isn't going to see too much play. I've given it a sort of halfway house 6.5 out of 10, though in reality probably it's just not going to see too much play in most standard Space Marine lists, though it's far more tempting for Death Watch and their veterans. For its counterpart, the Razorback is in a fairly similar situation. This one's a Rhino chassis, but for 20 points more you lose some fire points and stick a big gun on the top, often a twin links las cannon. This guy actually gets a solid buff for the unit jumping out of it though, allowing you to reroll wound rolls against the same thing that it shot, which is pretty nasty with multi-melter Devastators, potentially in the Firestorm Assault Force. You could have a unit that's hitting pretty seriously nasty with their anti-tank weapons and using the Razorback's good movement to get in range. Otherwise though, it just doesn't have many options to transport, the vast majority of Primaris units being locked out. But folks using the Deathwatch veterans, in their army they generally tend to prefer Rhinos, and compared with the Rhino has lower transport capacity, slightly pricier and no firing deck. Overall I've given it a 6 out of 10, just feels super niche and rather dependent on detachments and units that aren't considered particularly strong right now. For the Primaris Battlefield Taxi Service, we've got the Impulsor. This one's 80 points for an open-top transport vehicle that mounts a top hatch upgrade of some sort or another similar to the Razorback. It's got a transport capacity of 7, so it can take a 6 model squad with a character attached if that's what's desired. Has a good movement and an open firing deck so you can fire all models out of it. I've seen some people using it with Hellblasters embarked and use it to tank the hazardous rolls on the vehicle itself, though for more people I've seen them use it with melee units and basically use it more as a staging vehicle, moving it up into the midboard, maybe behind a ruin or next to one so that things can get out in safety, and then on the go turn when the melee unit jumps out, it can disembark 3 inches out of the front of the tank so extend its threat range and get more reliable charges. Things that could make good use of that might be things like Blade Guard plus a Judaseer, Inner Circle Companions with a character leader, Sword Brethren with Hellbrecht, maybe Assault Intercessors or Stern Guard plus an attached captain. Though for a different take, I've seen a couple of people using cursors with it as a sort of utility role, using the scout to move them forward and getting a fairly solid amount of small arms fire between that and the vehicle's output. Its durability is pretty solid for 80 points. It can advance and drop a unit if it makes sense, though that would trade off its firepower. It does get a stubber plus some storm bolters and then its top hatch upgrade. I've seen people use literally all of them, though the vast majority are either going for the missile or the 5+ invulnerable save. They are the ones that I'd be most tempted to as well. It could be quite nice in Firestorm Spearhead. It quite likes Advance and Shoot in combination with its special rule, and it also gets better for Black Templars as well. The bolt-on multi-melter is quite a nice upgrade and works quite well with Sword Brethren for them. For weaknesses, it's maybe a bit more borderline in detachments that have access to Advance and Charge. For those, it might be more tempting to stage the units behind ruins and just dispense with the transport. I think there's diminishing returns on spamming multiple of them. It's maybe a bit of a luxury choice where you might want one or two, but probably not more than that for most armies. And for ranged unit combos, the low transport capacity could be an issue. You can't transport maximal squads of Hellblasters, and Eradicators can't get in either. So for those, you might be tempted by a Repulsor. Overall though, I feel like it's usable enough for a bunch of different melee combos. I've given it a 7.5 out of 10 overall. I might have been tempted enough to push it up to an 8. Lastly, for the transports, we've got the Space Marine Drop Pod. These ones have had their new models recently. They remain at 70 points. They basically do the same sort of thing as before with a few small tweaks, basically giving you the power to deep strike a unit and do so turn 1, but now with a slightly upgraded transport capacity, fitting 12 models in there somehow, so you can have a maximal shooting combo with a leader attached, and also having the chance to make a charge out of it at 9 inches, which wouldn't be reliable but gives you a smaller chance to get some more damage. Feels like it might be nicest for things like Librarius Stern Guard, perhaps Infernus Marines buffed by Vulcan Hestarn already on the board, or perhaps Hellblasters with a Lieutenant or other damage combos like that. Melee combos just wouldn't be so reliable to get into the fight. For downsides, it is paying a very big premium to drop a first turn unit though. I think 70 points is just in the level where most people aren't really going to consider it too carefully, not compared with Strategic Reserve, buying in transports, or just foot slogging up the board, or putting things in Strategic Reserve. They won't have the same sort of godly delivery that the drop pod has, but you might not be losing loads of utility for that. You might not necessarily even be guaranteed any great targets turn 1 if the opponent's hidden really well behind ruins, and a mobile unit on the board can have issues as well, potentially allowing enemies to hide in melee so you can't shoot them with it, which could be annoying if that's your only way to deal with them. Overall, I've given the drop pod a 5.5 out of 10. I feel like it's going to be a bit more of a fun option than a super competitive one, though obviously very iconic for Space Marines getting into the fight. Then finally for the vehicle section, we've got the Space Marine Fortification in the Hammerfall bunker, 175 points for a 14 wound, toughness 12 vehicle with a 2+ save, getting some free overwatch with its defensive arrays, likely a bunch of heavy bolters, a big missile shot, and potentially it could be another source of cover for any units sheltering behind it. For the points cost though, its damage output is pretty pitiful. It is fairly tough, but just doesn't shoot very hard at all, and the overwatch isn't enough to make up for that. It can't claim objectives with OC0, and it can't move around the board to gain lines of sight. Hitting on a 4+ makes it more vulnerable to modifiers if the opponent does care about the damage output for some reason, and again could potentially have the issue of immobile units, so tagging it in combat, and enemy units hiding there if they can charge far enough. Overall feels like durability and maybe some deep strike screening and a tiny bit of threat is all it's really got going for it. I've given it a 2 out of 10 here. Moving on though, let's talk about Space Marine characters. I'll start with the generic ones and then move on to the named ones. First up, we've got the various flavours of Captain. We'll go through the individual ones in a second, but for the most part they've got pretty good melee compared with most characters, plenty of attacks and access to some good weapons like Power Fists. They generally provide discounted stratagems to their unit once per battle round, so a -1 to the cost, which could be nice enough for Armour of Contempt or re-rolling charges quite commonly, though obviously certain detachments are going to be quite big. They usually have a 4+ invulnerable save for their Iron Halos, and then the specific ones will help out with their own special buffing rules and extra stuff. For downsides, as a class they tend to be a bit pricier than most of the other support characters that might lead units. Aside from the stratagems, most of them don't really give direct damage or defensive increases to their squads, and compared with most classes, their value is extra linked to the detachments, given that if you've got a good detachment with stratagems that you want to use on that unit, getting them discounted is going to be a bigger deal. For the specific flavours of Captain, the standard one I feel like is a particularly standout one. He's 80 points and has the biggest variations of units that he can lead. In Codex he can hit particularly hard with Assault Intercessors or Stern Guard, giving him some big rerolls when needed, as he gets that one big activation turn where he gets +3 attacks and devastating wounds on his profile, which pairs incredibly well with 4 rerolls to wound, the Assault Intercessors versus mid-board objectives, and the Stern Guard against the Oath of Moment targets. He could be nice enough on any other fighter units that enjoy free stratagems of course though. He's quite good in Blood Angel's Liberator Assault group with that going on as well, where the +2 strength and the +1 attack takes everything up to 11. Overall feels hard to go too far wrong with, provided you've got squads that justify him. Some of the units that he can lead require locked loadouts, and he might be better in things like Gladius with access to advance and charge, and maybe that Lance stratagem for an easy damage buff for his free strats, perhaps a little bit more so than other detachments out there. The Phobos captain's 80 points, and he allows you to redeploy a bunch of infiltrating Phobos Marines or scouts. Redeploying infiltrate units can be quite nice, as it means that you could go aggressive with the way that you've deployed them, and then after you've seen how the opponent has set things up, choose to set things up in a different way, doing your best for both screening and then remaining safe from the enemy turn 1. It really feels like quite a lot is all hinging on that one special rule though. It is useful to have, but then the captain's own profile is a bit lackluster beyond that, and discounted stratagems for the Phobos Marines only really go so far, as they don't tend to be big hitting damage dealers. I gave him a 6.5 out of 10. The Gravis captain is also 80 points. He is tanky with his bigger toughness and -1 damage, and his extra attacks that he gets from his second weapon. The most common place that I've seen him in competitive lists recently is, interestingly enough, just running completely solo with the Armor Indomitus in Gladius Task Force. That gives him a 2+ save, a 5+ feel no pain, and the -1 damage that he has already just means that he's very hard to take out in his own right. With his melee damage, he has enough threats to solo some smaller squads. Otherwise, could be nice enough with aggressors, maybe in Firestorm as a good option for them. For his actual leader role, he'll make squads high commitment and perhaps competes with the Apothecary Biologist. The Terminator captain's 95 points. He deep strikes, provides support to a unit that quite likes free stratagems, and reroll charges is nice enough out of deep strike, giving you around about a 50-50 chance to get in and not having to burn a command point reroll to do it. He is, however, the most expensive captain. 95 points just feels a little bit much for what he adds, and the reroll charges still don't actually make him likely to make the charge into melee overall, and still maybe rapid ingress a better idea, though he could use that for free and discounted. Being a Terminator leader choice doesn't help as well when Terminators aren't super strong. Then finally we've got the Jump Pack captain. He's 75 points and got a nice points decrease recently. He can lead the Vanguard veterans or jump intercessors, and as well as the free stratagems, gives you the +1 strength on the charge, so adds his own good melee profile and amps up the squad's power as well. For core Codex Space Marines, both jump intercessors and Vanguard veterans might struggle a bit being the primary damage dealers. They'll feel like either can just about work if you're willing to give them some stratagem support. They will quite like the Lance stratagem in Gladius. He's a bit of a staple unit in Blood Angels, and I'd rate him far higher there though. He's great both in Liberator Assault Group in making those units far more threatening in their own right, or Angelic Inheritors where he allows the character keyword into the unit, and that could be good with Sanguinary Guard as well. I've given him a 7 out of 10 for core Codex Space Marines. I'd rate higher for Blood Angels though. Next up, for the second in command, standing bravely beside them, we've got the Primaris Lieutenants. Games Workshop's favourite units generally give lethal hits to their led squads, allowing them to punch up better, which is quite nice as quite a lot of Space Marine elites tend to have sort of more mid-strength than high strength for infantry units, and this can make them far more capable of being relevant against monsters and vehicles. They can also double up on characters, so it can attach with either a captain or a chapter master, so you could get enhancements in a unit that also has one of the named chapter masters in, which is quite nice. Each lieutenant also has a bonus special rule, and they're cheaper than their captain counterparts. For the specific lieutenants, the standard one is by far the one with the most options. He could join things like Hellblasters or Blade Guard, helping both units of Space Marine elites punch up against tough stuff so much better. It's got the option to take a Storm Shield for better defense, or Power Fist if you just want some hard-hitting melee attacks, and its bonus rule of fall back and shoot and charge really can be quite a powerful one in the right situation. Overall, it's got a lot of potential with quite a few different units. It's really a bad choice. I guess against units that you're already wounding on a 3+, his lethal hits doesn't really come into so much effect in terms of being big damage dealing, maybe more being a bit more insurance against enemy units that you can't handle, as opposed to doubling down on things that you're already good against. He might have overlap with certain other rules that could grant lethal hits too. Overall, I still think he's strong though. I've given him an 8 out of 10. Then there's the Phobos Lieutenant. He gives one of the Phobos units lethal hits and a move-shoot move of 6 inches. The move-shoot move could get them across the board surprisingly speedily. Perhaps could have some interest within cursors, popping out and marking targets, then hiding once more. Perhaps one of the more interesting things for him though is that he is the single cheapest deep striker unit that the Space Marines have on offer. So if you just wanted 55 points for a cheap model to drop in and do a secondary objective, he can do that, and with quite a small base that can't really easily be screened. He does have fairly low damage output though, and isn't likely to make a Phobos unit go from being a small threat to a big threat all by himself, and a lot of the units that he might otherwise lead are pretty happy just being kept cheap and putting the points towards more units as opposed to one extra fancy one with a lieutenant leader. Overall, I've given him a 6.5. Then finally there's the Reaver Lieutenant. He can only join the Reavers and nothing else. He gives them the lethal hits and also buffs the range of their OC debuff, which maybe could allow them to hide out of line of sight and still affect units that are on objectives nearby. On a really good day, maybe stopping certain units from even taking the objective, though it's going to be super situational depending on the opponent. It's pretty annoying that he prevents them from deep striking though, which is quite a big deal for Reavers. And again, in general, they're just not really a squad that really wants a leader, more happy just to be kept cheap at 80 points. I just don't think that it really adds anywhere near enough to justify his cost, and he probably needs to just put that towards other units more likely than not. Just for being so niche, I've given him a 3 out of 10. I feel like you don't really want to use him to make use of the model because you want to. One lieutenant functions very differently from the rest though, and that's the Combi Lieutenant. He's 70 points as the Space Marine Lone Operative. Cheap lone operatives just tend to be really handy to have in general for secondary objectives and screening purposes, and he's no exception. Opponents can't interact with him outside of 12 inches, so he's free to survive doing actions and things like that, provided that he's not being super aggressive. And the Combi Weapon Lieutenant is extra annoying to deal with, as he gets to move around with 6 inches if the opponent moves within 9 inches of him, so when they're pushing up to mid-board objectives and things, he can potentially just hide behind backfield ruins, or just back away from charges. That makes him very hard to kill, and even on his base stat line he's not got terrible durability. Stealth and a 5+ feel no pain help him out there, and otherwise he has a tiny bit of melee damage that could help out against some lighter infantry. Marks the central objective for reroll ones to wound against the enemies that go there, and could potentially bear some interesting enhancements in certain detachments, maybe Master of Machine War in Ironstorm, or Command Point Disruption in Vanguard Spearhead. SA is the sort of model that tends to be better in more competitive play and high-minded lists, more so than more casual games, where people might just get a bit more value out of some more damage and defense. For his weaknesses, he's got very little damage output, and perhaps could be competing with the Calidus Assassin for the lone operative role, or other various Space Marine support units that are in a similar sort of price range. He's definitely an interesting model and annoying to keep up with though, particularly with someone playing them well. I've given him an 8.5 out of 10. They do feature in a whole bunch of competitive lists. Next up, we've got the Space Marine Librarians. As a class, they add their smite attacks for damage D3 shooting for a bunch of attacks to hit medium infantry, and then generally provide some sort of protection against psychic attacks and a little bit of melee with a force weapon. Then they each get their own buffing rules, and of course they're going to be great in the Librarius Conclave, where basically as well as their main stuff, they also unlock their detachment rules, which has really quite a lot of possibilities for the sheer amount of things that they can do with them. For weaknesses, their melee is not quite as strong as most captains or lieutenants. The psychic keyword can be a downside for the anti-keywords out there, and unlike lieutenants or captains, you can't take a second character within the unit, so they will lock out other choices if you want to build a big squad. For the standard librarian, he's 65 points and he gives a 4+ invulnerable save to his unit. I feel like for most normal Space Marine units, most of the time he's not particularly standout. The most obvious pairings might be things like Hellblasters or Stern Guard, which are important enough to warrant having the defensive buff, and he could also contribute with a bit of damage output to the shooting that they'll already be doing. I feel like he only really gets good with certain specific chapters or detachments though. Obviously Librarius Conclave, where he's going to be pretty great with just about everything. In particular, he could bear Fusillade for Stern Guard, or maybe with Dark Angels where they can join Inner Circle Companions, and they're a unit that can get lots of value out of a 4+ invulnerable save with their 3 wound profile. Elsewhere though, he feels like more of a side grade of a unit than a direct upgrade, basically increasing the durability and damage by a little bit, but also increasing the points by a bit, and not really overall adding too much. Overall, I've given him a 6.5 out of 10, definitely far better in some armies than others. For the Terminator Librarian, they're 75 points. They're easy enough to use with sustained hits and good durability with their Terminator armor. They give sustained hits worn at range and in melee, so basically amp up the damage of any Terminators against their targets. I have seen him get used for faction-specific Terminators, maybe an interesting choice if you want something to bear an enhancement in one of the various Terminator-focused detachments. The Dark Angels have some, and again obviously good in Librarius, where the overall unit can be really quite threatening with lots of options. The main downsides may be competition with other options for Terminator leaders, perhaps in particular the Terminator Chaplain, as he adds a lot to their melee. Again, I've given him a 6.5 out of 10 for most armies, like regular Terminators, just not super standout unless there's a specific detachment and reason to run him. At the same time, certainly not unusable though. Then there's the Phobos Librarian. He's 70 points, and he's perhaps most commonly used to go with infiltrators, and his stealthy special rule allows you to not be shot outside of 12-inch range, so you've got a unit that could be camping in the backfield, denying deep strike at to 12 inches, unable to be shot at greater than 12 inches, and then the Librarian can actually add a little bit of muscle and punch to the squad, to the point where they might be able to handle some medium infantry style units that threaten the backfield. Here's quite a big investment on an already pricey unit though. You really are putting some big points into keeping the backfield absolutely safe that is going to take away from the main advance. Next, we've got the Chaplains. Their special rules are to give a +1 to wounds to allow melee units to punch up against tougher stuff. They've got Leadership 5 to make their squads harder to break with Battle Shock, and then they'll usually attack with a bunch of Strength 6 and Damage 2 attacks with their Crozius Arcanum, and have a Rosarius for a 4+ invulnerable save. As a class, they may be competing with the Lieutenants that offer a similar sort of punch up buff against tough vehicles with their lethal hits. The Lieutenants largely having slightly better melee damage as well with their Power Fists, and again, like Librarians, they look out of taking second characters within the same squad. For the Chaplains, the standard on foot one could be reasonable enough to lead Blade Guard, or maybe Assault Intercessors. I think I'd be more tempted by Blade Guard of the two though. He also gives a cancel battle shot buff once per game. I feel like he's not awful, but at the same time I've rarely seen him used versus Lieutenants for leading those kind of units in 10th edition. I feel like the Lieutenant is just the overall better leader for those squads, though not by massive amounts. If you want to make a Chaplain work, I don't think he is massively inferior. The Terminator one is 75 points. For Terminator's mid-strength attacks at strength 8, he can help them punch up a good amount. He might be tempting enough for an Assault Terminator squad or a regular Terminator squad, and I've seen him get used with Deathwing Knights for the Dark Angels with their mid-strength power weapons, presuming that you don't want the maces of course. He also gives the Terminators a 4+ mortal wound protection, which is quite nice in itself as that's one of the more efficient ways to deal big damage to Terminators. Again, if Terminators were a bit more relevant, I think he would be too. I've given him a 7 out of 10 here. I'm not sure if that's a little bit on the generous side. Potentially could have been a bit lower. The Bite Chaplain is 75 points. For that cheap cost, he's got a fairly impressive stat line, good durability stats, some shooting, and really quite good buffing rules, devastating wounds, and a +1 to wounds. Unfortunately, he's largely locked to giving that to Outriders though, which makes him more limited, and merely just about makes them limping into just okay as a mainline damage dealer, as opposed to being particularly strong, and paying quite a big premium to do so. Could be interesting enough to run in Stormlance that way though. I've given him a 6.5 out of 10. Even for more biker-focused chapters like Ravenwing, he's still going to have a tough time being taken versus the Ravenwing command squad. Then finally there's the Jump Chaplain for 75 points, +1 to wound on the Vanguard Veterans, and the Jump Intercessors certainly helps out with their lower strength attacks. He also gets a Power Fist for a bit more direct threat as well. For his special rule, he allows some more mortal wound impact hits on the charge, which could double down on the rule by the Jump Intercessors. Overall, he doesn't hurt, though I feel like with the recent points drop on the Jump Captain, that's probably the more tempting choice. I'd probably be going Captain versus Chaplain for most chapters. Maybe the Blood Angels could have some interest for leading Jump Death Company. Overall, I've given him a 7 out of 10. Again, maybe a touch generous, could have been a 6.5. Next up, we've got the Judas here at 70 points. He's the Executioner-style Chaplain. With his Temporal Hourglass shenanigans, he allows the units to fight first, which is quite a nice boost. On any big, scary mainline melee threats, that means that certain units just won't be able to charge them unless they can handle the damage output of a whole bunch of angry Space Marines first. His own melee with that Executioner Great Blade is really quite solid, with devastating wounds and precision with a chance to snipe some characters, and it's one that takes buffs really quite well, maybe things like the Honor Vehement and Gladius, though really good for certain ones like the Dark Angel's Ancient Weapons from Wrath of the Rock, or the Deathwatch Thief of Secrets. He gets a 4+ invulnerable save like Chaplains. I'd say maybe for Codex-led units, maybe the Blade Guard could be the best choice. He's definitely usable enough with a squad of them jumping at her an Impulsor, though I feel like he maybe has his best value actually in the more divergent chapters. Things like the Deathwatch Veterans, Inner Circle Companions, and Sword Brethren are all really common things to go with a Judas here. Perhaps compared with the Blade Guard just having a bit more chance to have enough melee threats to see off all comers and still have to worry things that might be toughness 10 or more charging into them. For downsides, the +1 attacks rule after slaying characters is rarely all that meaningful, and compared with other characters he doesn't have any direct damage buff to his unit, so it means that he might not punch up quite so well as a Lieutenant or Chaplain-led unit. Potentially he might have a squad that's fighting first but not hitting quite as hard as certain other Space Marine units out there. Overall, definitely a really interesting model though. I've given him an 8 out of 10, though I feel like he's more standout for some of the divergent chapters as opposed to the core codex. Next up, we've got the Tech Marine, 55 points for the Primaris vehicle support. His primary buff is to help out a vehicle with a +1 to hit and then repair D3 wounds, so that's going to be a good buff that's going to be well worth it on any big points intensive vehicle, maybe things like Vindicators, Repulsor Executioners, or Redemptor Dreadnoughts. He gets Lone Operative if near vehicles, so could have some utility value there, maybe standing on things in the open while not getting shot. And for a 55 point support character, he's got surprisingly good personal threat and stats, a power weapon and servo arm, a little bit of shooting, and also the ability to gain a bunch more attacks if a vehicle nearby dies. He could potentially take a big chunk out of an enemy unit when he charges in. He's a focal unit for Ironstorm Spearhead, as the one who can bear certain enhancements and just being good to have while there's lots of vehicles on the table. And overall feels like he's got solid value for his points cost. For downsides, he obviously requires you to have vehicles that are worth buffing in the first place. For certain faster ones and potentially in advance and shoot detachments, he might struggle to coordinate them with rushing forward to try and gain lines of sight. And he perhaps has a bit of anti-synergy with Oath and Moment on the 2+ to hit, where they're both going to be buffing the hit roll, and you might be able to get a +1 to hit within cursors as another option. Overall though, for really quite a cheap points cost, I feel like the mass of him works out rather well. I've given him an 8 out of 10 here. If you've got a bunch of Space Marine gun tanks, then he's a pretty good support option. Next up, we've got the Space Marine Banner Bearer Ancients, and there's 3 different flavours of these: a standard one at 50 points, a Blade Guard one at 45, and the Terminator one at 75. These guys all give +1 OC to their lead unit, so there's more chance they're going to tip the balance on mid-board objectives if 2 units wind up surviving on there, and if they happen to get battle shocked as well, they're still going to at least have some OC, so it won't go down to 0. The standard one can join the most units, but his special rule is pretty weak with just a 4+ feel no pain on objectives. The Terminator one gets a damage buff as the squad takes casualties, which for Terminators isn't actually that bad. There's a good chance that bigger units of those will potentially just take some casualties and not get fully wiped out. And then the Blade Guard one gets his single +1 attack buff once per game, though he doesn't actually get a melee weapon of his own, so he's having to amp up the squad, and then after that he might be a little bit of a detriment. He is abnormally cheap though. Like the Lieutenants, they can also join alongside another character, and some of them can bear certain relics that other characters can't. There's the Dark Angel's Pennant of Remembrance in the Unforgiven Task Force, but could be a good character just to bear relics in general. I've seen a Terminator Ancient bearing the Tannhauser's bones for Assault Terminators and Black Templars a couple of times, maybe doubling down on making sure they're a squad that's going to survive at least one turn. For their downsides, the OC that they bring is fine, but it is kind of situational. It might more change the amount of force that the opponent has to put into a unit to flip an objective, but a lot of the time it just might not matter. +1 OC doesn't really change too much if the unit just gets wiped out anyway, or if you manage to wipe out the enemy, then it doesn't matter either. The standard one's Feel No Pain is a bit of a weakish rule, and the Blade Guard one doesn't have a melee weapon. Overall, as a class, I've given them a 5.5 out of 10. Maybe that's simplifying things a bit. I would probably rank the Terminator one as the strongest, then the Blade Guard one, then the standard one, in that order. Next up, we've got the Apothecary. The Space Marine Medic is 50 points. He can attach to 2 wound infantry for the most part, and if the squad's been damaged but not outright destroyed, then you can resurrect a model automatically in your command phase. On top of that, he also has a 2+ chance to gain a command point if his entire squad is wiped out, retrieving their gene seed for the chapter. It feels like for their resurrection role, they might be best for Hellblasters in core Codex Space Marines. They're a valuable model that could get some value out of that, and more likely than most to inflict some chip damage on themselves and maybe not die, due to their whole hazardous rolls thing. For downsides though, he has very little damage output, so it doesn't really add to a squad there. And the biggest issue is relying on his squad being damaged but not destroyed to get any value at all in 40k with its big damage output, and particularly for 2 wound Space Marines, that just doesn't happen as often as you might hope. And if the opponent knows that they've got big incentive not to half kill a squad, they'll probably try not to, and leave them undamaged until they target them, and then try and wipe them out as best as possible. Even if he does get the chance to resurrect a model, if you say restoring a 22-point Hellblaster, that's still a long way from justifying his points cost. It basically means that you need to revive things not once but twice for him really to have overall value, and it feels like against the majority of games, for good players that's probably not going to happen, particularly for units like Hellblasters that aren't particularly tough to take down once they're exposed. It feels like a weakness that you can't join high value units like Blade Guard. Overall, it's not completely useless, and I have seen people who like him. I say it might be the sort of model that might be a bit better against less skilled opponents in more casual games, as opposed to people who really know what he does and try and counter him. I've given him a 5 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got the Battlefield Scientist Apothecary in the Biologist. He's 70 points and essentially acts as the lieutenant for aggressors and Gravis armor, giving his unit lethal hits, which is great for all the squads that he can join. Eradicators also enjoy that as well. Heavy intercessors in a pinch, but even then it struggles to make them good against really tough stuff. He doesn't really do any big melee damage at all, but he has OC3 base going to a big OC9 if his squad slays something in melee, maybe more likely to happen for the aggressors, so at least could be interesting enough to get some serious waste on objectives if that happens. You could also use him to join alongside a captain or Calgar for a really big stacked unit, and could do things like bear enhancements. Towards the start of the edition, people were using him to infiltrate alongside aggressors and Marnius Calgar, but he certainly could put other useful enhancements in the squads to amp up their damage or defense. He could bear fire discipline for the eradicators or aggressors potentially. For his downsides, he's got very little damage output, and he feels like the sort of model that's paying a really big premium for being a sort of core damage combo sort of thing. Ideally wanting a maxed out squad, probably invested with a way to get it there like a transport, and then maybe a big enhancement, or to try and make the overall thing worth it. I feel like at 70 points he just feels a far more borderline in that combo compared with where he was before. I certainly wouldn't be against him going down a bit. I've given him a 7 out of 10. Definitely interesting, though feels a bit pricey to me for what he does currently. Finally, that brings us to the Space Marine unique named characters. Starting off, we've got the Primarch with Rabute Guilliman himself, 320 points for the Primarch of the Ultramarines and Lord Commander of the Imperium. He's got pretty enormous melee with the Emperor's Sword or Hand of Dominion, so anything that he gets into contact with is likely to get hit very hard indeed. It's hard to take out with his pseudo lone operative rule if he can hang around some friendly infantry, and then even if the opponent does manage to get shots on him and manage to knock him down, there's every chance he's going to stand back up again on a 3+ with the Armour of Fate, having 6 wounds remaining. That's a big disincentive to the opponent going all out to maximally kill him and push aggressively on his position, as he might potentially just knock him down, then he stands back up and prepares to wreak vengeance. For his biggest advantages though, he has his double oath at the moment and his single discounted stratagem within 12 inches. For the oath you do have to make big decisions at the start of the turn though, nominating 2 targets and only being able to move on to the second once you've destroyed the first. Still though, when it amounts to re-rolling all hit rolls and a +1 to wound, it's a really big deal. The 3 stratagems are very easy to get value out of for Space Marines as well. Armour of Contempt can be a good one in the enemy turn if nothing else, and most attachments have got some good damage dealers. For downsides, he is really quite a big chunk of a list. He's around 1/6 of a 2,000 point army list just in himself, and he might want to take the rest of the models to justify his investment. There might be the danger that everything else just gets targeted and he winds up getting left till last, where even with one powerful model he's only going to be able to do so much. Big buffs aren't going to be worth much if there's nothing much else to use them with, and he does have some anti-synergy with Calgar now. If you include both of them in the same army list, then Marnie's Calgar can't farm his command points, as he won't be the Warlord. Overall though, a pretty spectacularly powerful model. The vast majority of people running competitive Space Marine lists seem to be running Ultramarines. I've given him a 9 out of 10. Talking of Calgar though, he's 200 points for the main man himself, plus his 2 Victrix Honor Guards. They have really quite a lot of melee damage between his own big damage 3 punches, plus the Honor Guard damage 2 and their invulnerable saves, and they can attach to another unit to make an overall very tanky and very dangerous squad. It's maybe most tempting to run with company heroes, so around about 300 points for a very durable bully sort of unit that could do other stuff like aggressors or blade guards. The bodyguards in particular are nice to add durability as well. Getting a 4+ invulnerable save into those units to tank some high AP hits could be really nice. Otherwise, he farms up a command point each turn. He has to be Warlord for that, but that's very reliable extra value into an army. And he basically gets all the doctrines on the go all the time, so advanced shoot and charge and fall back shoot and charge. It means that he's going to have better threat range than most and more options when he gets engaged. If you wanted to make his unit yet more threatening, you could also pair him with a lieutenant or apothecary biologist. For downsides, his unit will wind up being a very big investment squad. Even if going fairly cheap with company heroes, that's still going to cost a whole load of points. It can be a bit awkward to take down with different profiles that you might take saves on, but still ultimately aren't really super tough to the points cost. And as mentioned, having that anti-synergy with Guilliman doesn't help, stopping his command point generation if he's in the same list, though it doesn't look like at the moment that's actually been enough to put people off using them together. There's plenty of high placing tournament lists that still use both in tandem. Overall, he can make a pretty powerful damage and defense style unit, plus maybe generating command points. I've given him a 9 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got Uriel Ventris, the Ultramarines captain of the 4th Company. He's 95 points, and a big chunk of that value is in making a different unit gain the Deep Strike keyword, so it means that you could have a bunch of Hellblasters or Eradicators or something arriving onto the board exactly where needed. It could perhaps be stronger in Vanguard Spearhead as well for repeated redeploys on those. Then beyond that, he's a somewhat fighty captain with a bunch of Strength 6 and Damage 2 attacks. He could join Assault Intercessors for some rerolls, or Stone Guard for the same, or maybe the company heroes. And then when he's on the board, he's got his command point disruption aura. Units within 12 inches have to pay an extra command point for their stratagems, and that's quite a nice thing to have when fighting over the mid-board objectives. It's probably going to cost the opponent some resources, or make them think twice about using options they otherwise would have. Following points increases though, he is rather pricey, and doesn't directly buff his lead units. Is maybe more solid value as opposed to standout as he used to be, and he can no longer use his deep strike rule for Centurions, which were one of the best users of it with their big firepower and slow movement. Overall, I've given him a 7.5 out of 10. Really quite a strong model, but plenty of competition from the other Ultramarines characters. Speaking of which, we've also got Chief Librarian Tigurius here. He does quite a lot for 75 points. In particular, he's got particularly punchy damage from his main Psyche attack, plus a little bit of quality melee, a 4+ invulnerable save for him personally, and a 4+ feel no pain against Psyche and mortal wounds for his unit. He also makes his units a -1 to hit, and gives them a once per battle round discounted stratagem, which includes Overwatch. Fairly easy to get value from that. It feels like maybe the most obvious place for him to go with is Stern Guard, and then the overall squad is just a very dangerous one against the Oath of Moment target, rerolling all hits and wounds and +1 to wound. Great for the squad's own damage, and good for his psychic damage and melee as well. He could be a solid alternative for a Space Marine captain, for a unit that's just going to absolutely annihilate anything it goes into with the Oath. It's also standout strong in Librarius discipline as well, basically having all his good value, plus more layered buffs from that detachment rule. For weaknesses, it's maybe a shame that he can't join Hellblasters. They'd be quite a natural fit with him. He can't pair with other characters, and can't go with company heroes, and has good competition from the other Ultramarines characters. Overall, I feel like he's got some pretty solid value between all that though. I've given him a 7.5 out of 10. Next up, we've got Cato Sicarius. He's 85 points for a captain that gives some different movement buffs for his unit. It allows them to scout forward to get into the midboard. Could be interesting enough in a transport like an Impulsor. His unit gains the assault keyword for their weapons, and once per turn he has a big reactive move of a full 6 inches. That's definitely one with some interesting options, maybe allowing him to go somewhere fairly bold and then hide behind terrain when the enemy gets too close, or back away from a melee. He's got some alright melee of his own to add into a squad, a 4+ invulnerable save as per regular captains. It could be interesting enough for things like Stern Guard, Assault Intercessors, Company Heroes or Blade Guards, and could join alongside a Primaris Lieutenant if desired. For his downsides, I would say it's slightly pricey for his buffs at 85 points, and his support rules don't get the free stratagems or any direct buffs to the actual damage of his unit, so it's just going to be their datasheet rules and what you can get via stratagems to help them out. The reactive move buff is maybe the single most valuable thing that he gives his squads, though it's maybe a rule that's just a bit more powerful for the units that can flex into it just as needed. Could be interesting enough in Vanguard Spearhead for the potential from backing away further from charges though, I suppose. Despite some interesting movement rules though, he's just got lots of competition from the other Space Marine characters, meaning that he's used kind of rarely. I've given him a 6.5 out of 10. Again, maybe one of the models that's better in sort of high-minded, big movement shenanigans in competitive play with terrain, as opposed to more casual games slamming units together for big damage. Finally, for the Ultramarines characters, we've got the main man of Space Marine 2 himself in Lieutenant Titus. He is a 70 points Tacticus Armoured Space Marine, who gives sustained hits 1 to his lead squad, and then for his own damage output he's got a whole bunch of damage 1 attacks with anti-infantry 2+. For a character who's also a little harder to put down than most, with 5+ feel no pain and 5 wounds. The sustained hits 1 buff definitely isn't awful. It will be a bit better at punching down against lower toughness targets, though it also means that his lead units aren't going to be quite so hot compared with lieutenants at punching up against tough stuff like monsters and vehicles. I feel like the sustained hits buff in itself isn't too bad, it's just more what goes with it isn't the most overwhelming for Titus. Having only low AP damage 1 attacks that hit infantry just makes him super limited compared with other buffing characters, and his bonus supporting rule of a fights on death on a 2+ for him personally often won't be relevant if it's something tough that killed him. Overall, between all that and the regular lieutenant being cheaper, being able to combo with other characters, and getting a power fist with a better special rule generally means that Titus gets a bit overshadowed. Maybe could be interesting for Stern Guard or something on paper. Though even there, I'd probably want a character with more melee damage output to absolutely go into the Oath of Moment target. Moving beyond the Ultramarines now, and next up we have Corsair Khan of the White Scars, a 70 point fighty captain here, who has devastating wounds melee with precision for his own profile, and has quite a good melee buff for his lead unit, giving them assault with their ranged weapons, and then lance when they charge into close combat for a +1 to wound, or for a fairly cheap model. As a bonus, he also gets a 1 command point boost for slaying a character model if he manages to do so, and he makes Outriders in his army OC3, so a bit more weight on objectives for them. 9 OC out of an 80 point unit that moves fast is rather nice. He could potentially go with Assault Intercessors for reroll wound rolls, though perhaps with Blade Guard veterans and alongside a Lieutenant for lethal hits might be the best way to go. That should be fairly solidly fighty and hit pretty hard. His main downside might be that he's just a single character chapter that locks out all other special character choices, and it just doesn't provide as much value as the Ultramarines overall, That's kind of common to most of the rest of the Space Marine chapters currently. He's a very solid choice for leading a melee unit, but maybe just isn't super crazy amounts better than a captain or lieutenant to lead a squad. I've given him a 7.5 out of 10 though, or an individual datasheet basis, really quite good. Next up, we've got Ironfather Pharos of the Iron Hands. He's 95 points for an unusual mixed character offering. He joins Gravis squads and can give them a 5+ feel no pain, making them notably quite durable, and particularly say a small squad of heavy intercessors with that. He does Tech Marine things for vehicles nearby, so a +1 to hit, and then also a big 3 wounds restored. That's really quite a lot on something like a Redemptor Dreadnought. And then on top of that, he's got a fairly respectable damage profile in his own right. His great big axe plus a bit of shooting with his Forge Bolter. Feels like he's a nice enough bully unit alongside some heavy intercessors, slogging into the mid-board and being an absolute pain to destroy for their durability. Hopefully supporting a vehicle with +1 to hit and rerolls as he goes. And he also makes heavy intercessors OC3 as well, to get more weight on objectives while they live. Perhaps the biggest downside is that he needs to get value out of sort of 3 fronts, buffs to infantry vehicles and also his own melee profiles. That could be hard to do all at once and might have different conflicts as to the different units wanting to go in different ways. He is really quite a lot pricier versus Tech Marines that can do pretty well the same buff. If you're just looking to purely support vehicles, they do feel like the more efficient option. And again, he's currently a single character chapter that just doesn't compete super well versus Ultramarines. Overall though, definitely some interesting value once more. I've given him a 7 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got Kayvan Shrike of the Raven Guard. He's 100 points for a jump pack chapter master with lightning claws. They get twin linked melee with AP -2, damage 2, and precision to snipe out enemy characters without having to spend command points for epic challenge. He leads either the jump intercessors or the Vanguard veterans, and he gives them basically lone operative style protection. You can't shoot them outside of 12-inch range. That makes for a big scary unit that you can't interact with properly and one that can move around the board really quite fast. So very likely between that to get the strike on the enemy rather than the other way around. And if he's going with jump intercessors as well, they'll also be OC2. So really quite a nice buff to them scrapping over objectives and makes it a lot more tempting to take more units in support as well. He can return to reserve as well, which could be nice enough maybe for some early game positioning. He could jump his unit around to different places if it doesn't look like he's imminently going to be making a charge. It feels like once he's committed though, that's going to be less useful, as his on the board position is far likelier to be able to make reliable charges than a 9-inch deep strike. Alternatively, he can also go lone operative and just be played almost like a Calidus assassin, but with more threats, more movement, and just the one jump off the board. I feel like that's maybe a little bit less common versus the big lead unit though, just as that feels like it's overall more value. For downsides, his overall damage for the points cost isn't enormous with the squads that he can lead. Without some other support, like say the Gladius Lance Stratagem, they might struggle with tough stuff. But overall, I feel like he's a really solid and valuable character, moving fast, reasonable damage, and some good supporting rules. I've given him an 8.5 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got the Imperial Fist, and first we've got the Gravis Armoured Tor Garadon. He's 90 points for an Imperial Fist captain with a great big monstrous power fist plus a grav gun. He's a specialist at taking down vehicles with strength 12, AP -4, and damage 4 in melee against them. Really nice into things like knight profiles at the moment. And also his grav gun is really nasty as well, boosted against the same sort of targets, so hitting with unusually hard damage output. Otherwise, he grants the ignore cover rule to his unit, which is nice enough for aggressors or heavy intercessors, maybe eradicators, though they'll usually not be having good saves against them. And his durability is okay for a character with his Gravis armor, I suppose. For downsides, he's just going to be far less standout if he's not fighting against his preferred tough targets. He needs to make sure that he can actually get his melee into the enemy vehicles and monsters, and he doesn't move all that fast, so might need a way to deliver him there. The ignores cover buff is okay, but maybe not crazy, and there are other ways that you could get that. And maybe none of his unit attachments really feel super perfect at the moment. Maybe could go with something like a small unit of 3 aggressors perhaps, or go for a really big squad, but then you've got an enormous investment unit. Heavy intercessors don't enormously want combat, but will protect him quite well. It feels like most things have got some trade-offs. If he can manage to get into tough stuff though, he can absolutely hit hard. I've given him a 7 out of 10 here with that enormous power fist punching down big things. Next up, we've got Darnath Lysander, 100 points for the capture of the first company of the Imperial Fists. He joins Terminator squads and gives them a -1 to wound if the strength is greater than the toughness. That's really quite handy for big durable units like that, where the majority of things that are going to threaten them or be wounding them quite well are the special weapons or anti-tank. In melee, he hits super hard with that great big hammer, strength 10, AP 3 and damage 3, all with devastating wounds, so a thunder hammer on steroids there. That's quite a nice profile to have mixed in with the Terminator more mid-strength, strength 8 and damage 2 kind of things, being able to be good against both elite infantry and toughness 10 vehicles. Once per game he becomes super hard to destroy, with a 2+ invulnerable save for a phase. If you can predict when he'll need that exactly, when his squad's likely to get depleted, that could have some seriously quite good value. And on top of all of that, he also makes Terminator's OC2 really quite nice for a big chunky durable unit, squads that maybe have more chance of surviving on the mid-board objectives, I guess particularly with him around with his -1 to wounds, so quite a helpful boost there. He doesn't really feel particularly weak to me, though I feel like he's more sort of fairly costed for his abilities as opposed to stand out for them at 100 points. He's pricier than the non-named Terminator characters that can also give some good value, and as mentioned, Terminators are unfortunately just a little bit on the mid side currently points-wise. If they got cheaper and they got more mainstream, then he'd get better. Overall, I've given him a 7 out of 10 though. Definitely an interesting character with some big stuff for Terminators. Next up for the Imperial Fist successors, we've got Pedro Cantor of the Crimson Fists. He's 90 points for a fighty chapter master. Good melee damage with a damage 3 power fist, perhaps surprisingly punchy range damage for a Space Marine character with Dawn's Arrow, and a little bit more durable than the average character too, with a 2+ save and a 6+ feel no pain. For his squad buff, his main big one is being able to trigger a +1 attack for all weapons in one turn, so that's range and melee. So you could potentially have a melee squad with double shot pistols and then charging in with an extra big punch, or maybe go with something like the Stern Guard that he's known for. Get 4 shots on those bolt rifles and then charge in against the Oath of Moment targets. On top of that, he's also got a damage buff to his squad as it takes casualties. If the enemy manages to damage but not destroy them, then he's going to hit far harder. Between that, perhaps Blade Guard or Stern Guard seem like the best units to lead. I might be more tempted by Stern Guard. He could take the place of a Space Marine captain there. And then you've got a unit that shoots really hard and punches really hard against the Oath of Moment targets, and they also become OC2 as well, so even more incentive to use some. Overall, he does feel like he's fairly solid value for a unit, maybe biggest weakness being a bit jack of all trades, where his +1 attack boost is alright, but only lasts for a certain amount of time, and is equally good at range and melee, where he more wants to go for a melee role. Perhaps the single most annoying thing about his datasheet though is that I believe that you can't trigger that special rule while he's embarked on a transport, which is likely exactly how him and a squad of say 5 Stern Guard might want to get to the front. I think if it weren't for that restriction, I'd likely rank him a little bit higher than this. I've given him a 7 out of 10. He definitely can have an enormous punch along with a unit, though again he does have the downside of looking at other named characters from other chapters. Next up, we've got Vulcan Hestan of the Salamanders, 100 points for the Salamander's Forge Father, and he gets an appropriate Melter and Flamer buff, marking 1 enemy targets for reroll wound rolls for those ranged weapons with the Salamanders that target them throughout the whole army. It could work pretty well with their themed Firestorm detachment, with strength 10 melter weapons up close, plus torrent weapons with extra strength, and maybe even the devastating wound stratagem that works really well on Infernus Marines. Beyond that, he's got a boosted heavy flamer with the Gauntlet of the Forge, and some captain style melee with his spear. It's fairly durable with a 2+ save and a 6+ feel no pain, and then he gets really quite a big weight on objectives, OC10 with a 4+ feel no pain when he's on one nominated objective in the midboard, maybe using something like a squad of company heroes to get him there. He also makes Infernus Marines OC2 as well, so more incentive to use a few of those in his list. For downsides, he is pricier than most supporting characters, and he does need some building around with his certain useful units. Maybe one of the slightly frustrating things about him is there's a lot of the best units that he could buff already have twin links or rerolls, things like Eradicators or Aggressors with Flamestorm gauntlets. He's quite nice with other things though, maybe the Land Raider Redeemer being one of the best things to buff with its big Flamestorm cannons and multi-melter. Overall a solidly powerful character, I've given him a 7.5 out of 10. Finally for the Salamanders, we've got Adrax Agatone. He's 85 points for a big punchy captain with Malleus Noctum. He's basically a scary melee brawler character that hits really hard, usually with a squad of Blade Guard, hitting with a big strength 10, AP -2 and damage 3 on his hammer, and an AP -1 torrent pyre pistol. His squad buff is to give himself and his units reroll wound rolls in melee, so really nice for Blade Guard in particular there. Potentially, if his unit gets into a protracted combat, then he'll also halve objective control with those as well, which could be relevant on mid-board objectives. He could join his Blade Guard unit with a Primaris Lieutenant as well, so if you wanted an all-in combo squad, then they can hit monstrously hard and be taking down the toughest stuff that the enemy has to offer, perhaps slightly jumping out of either an Impulsor or a Land Raider depending on how many characters are attached to make sure they get into melee before being too shot up. For downsides, Blade Guard and him are likely to need delivery to get into melee, and without other buffs aside from his wound rerolls, his squad is still going to struggle with targets they'd wound on a 6+ like toughness 10 or more. Between his profile and buffing rule though, it's certainly going to do a whole load of damage. Overall I've given him an 8 out of 10. Just feels very hard to go wrong with as a primary damage dealer character in a Salamander's list. With the named characters talked about, that just about brings us to the end of this one though. Let me know your thoughts as to the Space Marine units down in the comments below. Any other interesting tricks that you've been using with them in various different attachments, and would you rate them any different in terms of power level? Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments as per always. Before we go, I'll just cycle back to the video sponsor in Titan's Terrain and talk through a few pros, cons and examples for their pop-up cardboard terrain system. As I mentioned earlier, I feel like this one's one of the terrain sets that's got bigger trade-offs versus the other ones out there. The main unique selling point of it is that it's just super easy to store and transport, everything folding completely flat and being really easy to set up and take down with that with the folding system. So nice if you've got not much space to store it at home or needs to transport stuff super small to go around to a friend's house. Like most terrain sets, it's far cheaper than a whole board of Games Workshop terrain, at least somewhat comparable to MDF or cheaper than some sets that I've seen out there. It doesn't need any painting or assembly as well, so hobby time is kind of tight as it is for many people. It is ready to go immediately. For potential downside, it is a bit less sturdy or hard wearing versus plastic or MDF, given it's made of cardboard and designed to fold flat. A bit more care needs to be taken of it compared with some of the other things, plus it's not always so possible to put heavier models in the upper floor ruins. They're not particularly well weight bearing. And otherwise, the other biggest criticism is the grid layout. It can be a little bit less good for 10th edition compared with some, just as it can create some firing lanes down the middle of the bits where the terrain pieces aren't, so it might be good just to supplement with maybe just an extra ruin wall or two to break up a couple of those. It doesn't exactly make tournament-approved terrain or anything like that, but I've heard good anecdotes that it's usable enough at a more casual level. In any case, for a few examples of their sets, they've got a Forgotten Furnace one here, all Chaos Runes and Glowing Foundries and things like that, all ready to make some Demon Engines no doubt. They've got a more standard Ruined City one in this Shattered Hive, bombed out ruins and armoured containers and things like that. And then they've got a more verdant set of ruins in the Overgrown Capital one. This one could be interesting enough for both 40k or fantasy settings. The ruins maybe not enormously specific to either. Each of those also has an expansion or centerpiece set as well, with 2 tiles being pushed together with a cathedral or an infernal spire. Those ones are sold separately. In any case though, check them out, links down in the video description if you'd like to take a look over their stuff, and of course a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. I'll leave that there for now though. Let me know your thoughts as to the Space Marine units down in the comments below. I look forward to hearing all your takes down in the comments. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. And if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, the Patreon page has links down in the video description alongside the affiliate discount links if you happen to be picking up any units in the near future. A big thank you to anyone supporting via either of those. In any case though, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.